We have discovered over 1,000 different species of Pokemon so far, and I think they're all related to one another on a big tree of evolution. Game Freak's been dropping hints in Pokédex entries for years, and I have connected them all together in this web of evolution. This is not evolution as we see it depicted in the game, but instead in the true sense of the word, adaptations of species over millions of years altered by their environments and external factors. So we're not talking about Squirtle becoming a Lapras, more so we're going to try and find their common ancestor and work out how all Pokemon are related, including legendary turtles like Terapagos. I mean, think about it. How do these biological manifestations of the myths and legends of the Pokemon world fit into a tree of evolutionary life? And what about us? Where do humans fit into the Pokemon tree of evolutionary life? Alongside alien Pokemon and paradox Pokemon, Ultra Beast ghost Pokemon, artificial life, even viruses like Pokerus. I have spent many years investigating all of these different forms of Pokemon life and the canon of the Pokemon world to give you now the most comprehensive look at the tree of Pokemon evolution. So let us start at the very beginning, as we should, in the Kanto region, with one of the earliest forms of life to appear on Earth, mollusks. Mollusks come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and though not exclusively, they are often marine in nature. They are invertebrates, meaning they have no spine, and in the Kanto region, both Omastar and Cloyster fall into this phylum. Throughout this series, the Pokemon mollusks will appear as either shelled or non-shelled, and of course, Omastar and Cloyster are both shelled. These two Pokemon in particular are some of the oldest in the Pokemon world, and the animals that they're based off of, some of the oldest creatures in our world, giving rise to much of modern day life. And this can be seen in the Pokédex entries of the Pokemon that, it is so perfect that we are starting with here. It is our Lord and Savior, Helix. Omastar. And by the way, throughout the series, I'm going to be referring to the final evolutionary stage of each Pokemon, because Omanyte and an Omastar are the same Pokemon. The Omanyte is just the premature form of what it ultimately becomes. This means for a Pokemon with a more radical metamorphosis, like Caterpie into Butterfree, for example, we'll be looking at the traits of Butterfree, the final stage to determine where the Pokemon belongs on the evolutionary tree. Anyway, back to Omastar. We know that the reason this Pokemon became extinct is because its shell grew too big and heavy, possibly to protect it from predators at the time, but this slowed it down, meaning it could no longer catch up to prey like Shelder, which of course means that Cloyster existed at the time. This caused the Pokemon ultimately go extinct. Another type of creature that's even older than mollusks, though, is Nidaria, and in the Kanto region there's one of these as well, Tentacruel. Tentacruel is of course based off of the jellyfish, and they are known as the Zubats of the sea in their pre-evolved form, Tentacool. This is because they can be found absolutely everywhere across the Pokemon world, and this just goes to show that their successful propagation of the Pokemon world is due to an optimal design for their environment. And with the sea covering much of the Pokemon world, that's a whole lot of environment. In our world, Nidaria and jellyfish in general represent some of the oldest multicellular life forms. These complex life forms shed light into the origin of our own species as well as life across the planet. Of course, in the Pokemon world, we actually already know the origin of Pokemon life. It's Pokemon number 151, Mew. Mew is a mythical Pokemon said to contain the DNA of every single species out there. It's said to be the ancestor of all living Pokemon today, and it's able to learn TMs, well, every TM, as a result of having this incredibly malleable DNA. But how is this possible? Because Mew looks like both an embryo and a cat. It's a multicellular life form itself, very different from the single-celled life forms that we evolved from here in our world. Didn't Pokemon evolve the same way? I have a theory about this, but for legendary Pokemon and mythical Pokemon, and of course an explanation for Mew, you're gonna have to wait till a little bit later on in the series. For now though, I will be accepting Professor Oak's official research on this, and Mew is the ancestor of all living Pokemon. So we're gonna put Mew at the base of the evolutionary tree as our starting point, and we can already see some of those branches beginning to emerge with Nidaria and Tentacruel and Omastar and Cloyster as mollusks. Now, while it seems likely that much of Pokemon life did come from Mew and come from the sea, and much of it stayed there, like Sea King, which is, well, just a fish, many Pokemon life forms obviously made their way onto land in a later branch of life called Arthropods. It seems possible that many of these Arthropods came from an ancient fossil Pokemon that we know about called Kabutops. It was an avid hunter 300 million years ago with scythes on its forearms that would use to hunt down its prey. And some of the life forms that may have spread from this Pokemon, well, there's the crab Pokemon, Kingler, there's the gnat Pokemon, Parasect, the bee Pokemon, Beedrill, the beetle Pokemon in Pinsir, and then of course there's the moth Pokemon in Venomoth, and I already mentioned Butterfree. In the real world, moths and butterflies are very closely related, and it's in these Pokemon that you can see how Pokemon evolution is more of a metamorphosis than the evolution that we're describing in this series. There's also a classic Pokemon theory that suggests that Venonat, the larval stage of Venomoth, should have originally evolved into Butterfree, but in this instance that's obviously not a theory we're accepting. Instead, it is more evidence of the relationship between these two species. Seriously though, look at Venonat. How was this not the pre-evolution to Butterfree? Anyway, I digress. When we looked at all these bug or insect-like creatures, or as we're officially calling them here, arthropods, the thing that kind of unifies them is that they don't have spines like us. Additionally, the skeleton of a Pokemon like Kingler here is what's known as an exoskeleton, meaning the skeleton is on the outside of the Pokemon's body rather than on the inside. And it seems likely that all of these forms of life descended from a common ancestor, which in the fossil record may well be Kabutops. However, where Pokemon life continued to develop in the ocean, as I mentioned earlier, we get the emergence of a new branch of the tree of life, bony fish. Seaking, as I mentioned before, is one of those, with a skeleton on the inside, and you can actually see its horn protruding. That horn is likely made of bone, or possibly cartilage, but more likely bone, which comes from the skeleton that mostly is inside the creature. And if you're wondering, yes, there are non-bony fish, but we'll get to those a little bit later on. However, there is another branch where creatures started to leave the sea, and those are the amphibians, a whole new branch of the tree of evolution. In the Kanto region, there's only one that we know of, and that is Poliwrath. But don't let those gloves deceive you. This creature is very much based off of the real-world glass frog, and you can see in the tadpole stage, much like Poliwag, the intestines of this creature creating a spiral shape. A tadpole becoming a frog like this, by the way, two very different creatures, is again a perfect example of metamorphosis in a singular species, much in the same way that Pokemon evolution happens. A Poliwag turns into a Poliwhirl, and then a Poliwrath, or perhaps a Politoad, but we'll get onto that when we get to Johto. There is another Pokemon in the Kanto region that you might think to be a frog, and this is one that, wow, there has been so much debate and speculation and different opinions from different Pokemon researchers and real-world researchers in discussing, and that, of course, is Venusaur, one of the starters of the Kanto region. Venusaur looks much like a giant frog, and in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, you can see evidence of this Pokemon hopping around to follow you much like a frog. The name Venusaur suggests a relationship to dinosaurs and big reptiles of the ancient past. Many of the grass starter Pokemon are based on ancient reptiles. What Venusaur is based off of, as far as I can tell, and having had many discussions about this, is actually a synapsid, a sort of pre-dinosaur mammal that took very reptilian-looking forms, but were indeed closer related to modern-day mammals than they were reptiles. Venusaur is the only synapsid that we have on the entire tree of evolutionary history for Pokemon. I hope we find more one day, so it gets its own little branch. Now, when it comes to reptiles, Reptilia as we know it, yeah, this is another branch of the tree of evolution, and it comes in many different shapes and forms. We've seen lizards and snakes and turtles. When it comes to snakes, let's take a little look at Arbok, because this is one of my favorites. It's kind of an unknown fact of the Pokemon world, but yeah, Arbok is sort of the first regional variation. It's a great example of evolution in action. See, Arbok, across the regions of the Pokemon world that it appears in, has different hood patterns depending on where you find it. It's possible that these hood patterns help intimidate certain predators in the areas where you find them, which allows them to go about unscathed. This is sort of the original version of a regional variant. This is a species beginning to diversify into different forms that maybe over a millennia would become totally different species of Pokemon based on what is successful, what allows them to survive, and what allows them to reproduce. Then of course we look to those turtles, and yeah, we can't not talk about Blastoise, the starter Pokemon of the Kanto region, the water type that we all love. I did a video a long time ago suggesting that this evolutionary family was related to Lapras by way of a common ancestor, that being Tirtuga, a fossil that can be found in the Unova region. We'll get on to that, and I still believe that to be the case, except I don't think Lapras is a turtle. In fact, Lapras is based off of a Plesiosaur, which is an ancient form of Reptilia. So they're related and probably do have a common ancestor way back when, but it's not anything recent. And in fact, I think Lapras is probably more closely related now to a new part of the evolutionary tree, a new branch of Reptilia that doesn't exist in the real world, because at the end of the day, Pokemon is just a little bit more magical, and that is the branch Draconis. The dragons of the Pokemon world come in many different shapes and sizes. This is evolution with a high amount of variation across these types of creatures. And it's important to note here that what we're talking about here are dragons as creatures, not the dragon type of Pokemon. We cannot used for this series type as an indicator of how the Pokemon are related to each other, because every Pokemon can use moves of every type. Pokemon can change types due to various phenomenons in the Pokemon world, and we know as much from the dragon experts like Lance in the Pokemon world that Pokemon that aren't dragon type are still dragons, like Gyarados. Alongside Dragonite, which evolved from the Dratini line, a species that spends most of its life with a more serpentine body, there is also Gyarados, a Pokemon that is a sort of sea serpent. You might believe that Gyarados should be some kind of fish, but Gyarados is specifically inspired by a mythos of a carp jumping over a waterfall and transforming into a dragon. So you'd say, well, it started its life as a carp, but again, when we look to the Pokemon world, we're using the final stage. In this instance, Magikarp is just the first stage, the larval stage of what will ultimately become Gyarados. This is Gyarados' family. Gyarados is also particularly interesting as a Pokemon to look at when it comes to the Tree of Evolution, because it sheds light onto a phenomenon all across the Pokemon world known as shiny Pokemon. Shiny Pokemon are really rare variations of Pokemon where the melanin inside their biology seems to have changed. This is depending on where in the Pokemon world you are. There is a 1 in several hundred to 1 in several thousand chance of encountering these rarities. However, there's news reports from the Lake of Rage in Johto that shiny evolution was somehow induced by Team Rocket using radio waves. We know that radio waves and electromagnetic waves can manipulate the biology of Pokemon. This is actually seen in the Pokemon trading card game, in which Hoenn and his research team used electromagnetic waves to try and hunt down Mew. Mew, again, the Pokemon with DNA connecting to all other Pokemon species, and in their experiments it let out an electromagnetic or radio wave that altered the biology of the Pokemon, changing their types and actually causing many of them to become Gold Stars, or shiny Pokemon. So perhaps that's what's happened here with the red Gyarados. There are other dragons found in the Kanto region though. For example, if you've ever been to the Pewter Museum, you may have seen the old amber that contains the DNA of a Pokemon known as Aerodactyl. Now this Pokemon isn't a true dragon, it's more akin in fantasy to what we would know as a wyvern, the distinguishing main factor being that its arms are part of its wings. This may suggest that before modern dragon Pokemon like Dragonite came along, that dragon Pokemon used to have their arms and their wings attached into one another, and over millions of years of evolution, the arms on the wings, the hands on the wings became redundant, and a new set of limbs grew. This could place a Pokemon like Aerodactyl as an ancestor to all of Draconis, and over time, of course, and you can see it in their head shape as well, we would get a Pokemon more like Charizard. This Pokemon has such a fun biology. Obviously, it breathes fire, and it has fire coming out of its tail. It is the classical quintessential dragon, and it's possible that the way it's flying, the way that it's able to give its body lift, is due to the presence of methane in its body, or the ability somewhere in its biology to convert oxygen into methane. This is a gas that's very flammable and less buoyant than air, which would give the Pokemon lift as it flies. When we look at Charmander's Pokedex entries, we see that the Pokemon will perish if the fire on its tail goes out. It's possible that this is the Pokemon expelling excess methane, because methane is ultimately poisonous. If the fire goes out, that means that the body isn't expelling the methane that's inside, which ultimately could poison the Pokemon from within. All of this biology may be tied to a feature of this Pokemon known as the Flame Sac, which appears in the Pokedex entries of a number of other fire-type Pokemon like Torchic and Flareon. The Flame Sac being the result of convergent evolution, a trait that has appeared all across the Pokemon world but evolving in different branches of life, a successful tool for fire Pokemon because it allows them to deal with the intense heat inside of them and not burn up or poison themselves. Now, when you look to the dragons of the Pokemon world, you might think, aren't they related to dinosaurs? And yes, I think they absolutely definitely are. And another species in another branch of life that actually spreads from Reptilia and from Draconis, I'm sure they all share a lot of common ancestry, is the avians of the Pokemon world. As a bird keeper, I know for a fact that birds really are just living dinosaurs. You can see it in Pokemon like Pidgeot and Fearow that have these raptor-like talons and other raptor-like qualities in the way that they feast. Dodrio is an odd species of birds that seems to have evolved alongside these, but yes, is definitely still a bird. As so too are Golduck and Farfetch, which are clearly related to each other and are based off of ducks. And when we look to the fossil record of the Pokemon world, there actually is a single species of Pokemon that can be found that may well be a common ancestor between Draconis and avian Pokemon as well as reptiles, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. So let's scope out. We have Mew at the base of the Tree of Evolution, the ancestor to all Pokemon. We've got Nidaria and mollusks, arthropods and amphibians. We've got the bony fish in the sea, we have our Synapsid in Venusaur, and then we have this whole multi-layered complex branch with Draconis and avians and reptiles. There is only one other chief branch of the Tree of Evolution that we need to talk about, and it's the branch that we in the real world belong to, the mammals. But before I get into the mammalian branch, I have to mention a sort of mystery Pokemon that I had pondered about for a long time. See, back when I first covered this topic, I was confused about the Pokemon Slowpoke and its evolutionary family. Slowpoke is a Pokemon that can lose its own tail and regrow it like a salamander. Then again, it's aquatic, so maybe it's more like a hippo. At the same time, perhaps it's a sloth. It's very slow and doesn't register pain until long after the pain has happened. Let me know in the comment section down below what you think Slowpoke is if you don't know already, and I'm sure I'll reveal the truth to you by the time we get to the end of Kanto. Mammals, or Mammalia, here in the real world are a very successful branch of the tree of evolution. This is the age of mammals. These creatures are all vertebrates. They often have fur or hair. The females of the species often have mammary glands that produce milk for the young to drink. And apart from a very unique exception, which will come up later, they give birth to their live young. They do not lay eggs. And if all of this sounds familiar, that's because this is what we do, human beings. Except I don't believe that human beings in the Pokemon world evolved from Pokemon, but that's something we'll get to much closer to the end of the series. I do believe that humans are mammals. I don't think they are Pokemon mammals. There are, however, some human-like Pokemon in the Pokemon world: Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee, and of course Machamp. These Pokemon are very human-like and are likely in the Pokemon world tree equivalent of the great apes, much as we are here in the real world. Machamp's biology, though, is particularly interesting. It has this rock-hard exterior to its skin. This is a result of the way that this Pokemon goes through metamorphosis. The Golem line is something we'll get to much later on in the series, but for now, know this. You get a Machamp by trading your Machoke with somebody else's Graveler, and in the trading process, they seem to swap some elements of their DNA or copy them from one another. This is how Machamp ends up with an extra set of limbs which Graveler previously had, but it no longer has as a Golem. Then, of course, in the mammal branches, we have our Rodentia, so that's Raticate and its Alolan variant that can be found on the Alolan Islands. Raichu, which also has an Alolan variation. Regional variation is something that's going to keep on coming up and actually is very prevalent in the Kanto region, specifically in relation to other mammal species. And with mammals being the biggest part of the evolutionary tree, it just goes to show how diverse this category of life can become. Regional variation is another great example of why we can't use Pokemon type to determine a relationship to each other. We see this in the Cantonian Meowth, Galarian Meowth, and Alola Meowth, all of which are totally different Pokemon types and yet are clearly closely related to one another. And you can, much like with the Arbok, think about regional variations as sort of transitional forms between what the Pokemon might become one day. And to be clear, it doesn't happen one day. It's not that one Pokemon gives birth to another species of Pokemon that is a totally separate species, but rather small changes over time change these Pokemon's shapes so drastically that they are one day completely unrecognizable as the species that they are today. This is an event simply known as speciation. When we look to another part of the mammal branch, we see the marsupials, where there is the kangaroo-inspired Pokemon Kangaskhan and the almost definitely closely related to it Marowak and its Alolan form. You'll have seen the theories, of course, about how these Pokemon are related, how Cubone is just a Kangaskhan without its mother. You can see the little baby Kangaskhan in the pouch, and sure enough, when SOS chaining across the Alolan Islands, sometimes a Cubone will call in a Kangaskhan for help. Then, of course, there is Dugtrio and its Alolan form, and there's not a lot to add here. They're both based off of moles, and Alolan Dugtrio looks stupid. You might be wondering about Wiglet. Is Wiglet related to the Dugtrio line? And we will get to that when we get to Paldea, but no, it is not a regional variation. That's the whole point. There is also Sandslash and its Alolan form, which are based, of course, off of Pangolins, which is another form of mammal life. Hypno is based off of a creature known as a tapir, and quite closely related, actually, are Nidoking and Nidoqueen, which are based off of Rhinoceros. There is a fascinating idea, though, about Nidoqueen, a whole Pokemon theory about it. See, Nidoking and Nidoqueen stem from the same Pokemon, Nidoran male and female. Now this is sexual dimorphism in action, species that have different variations depending on their sex. We see this in actually a lot of species, including humans. In the Pokemon world, this typically manifests in species having different sized horns, tusks, teeth, different colors, or hair patterns. With Nidoran, it's kind of a special case, because typically, for example, with the Kalosian Pokemon Meowstic, both species of Pokemon, though very different, are considered ultimately the same species. They're both still Meowstic. But when it comes to Nidoran, they're classified as different species of Pokemon, and the Nidoqueen line is odd. Of all the Pokemon that cannot reproduce in the Pokemon Pokemon world, typically it's legendary Pokemon and baby Pokemon whose cells aren't mature enough to reproduce. But Nidoqueen and Nidorina are also under the category of Pokemon that cannot lay eggs. It might be that there's something different going on here, something with the creation of Nidoqueen. There is a theory that suggests that Nidorina, Nidoqueen, and the entire Nidoran female line exists as a result of early cloning experiments by Team Rocket. The leader of Team Rocket, Giovanni, does after all use Nidoking and Nidoqueen both on his team as some of his chief Pokemon. And in the Pokemon animated series, we see a Nidoqueen that seems to have suffered some kind of stunted growth. Stunted growth and being infertile are often the results of cloning here in the real world, but I digress. Now, this whole group of life that Nidoking and Nidoqueen are based off of are ungulates, which is a huge section of life. It includes bulls like Tauros, and Tauros has 3 regional variants. And then, of course, there's Rapidash and its Galarian form. Horses are also part of this group of life. As well as this includes species of creatures that have actually returned to the sea, like Dugong, which is inspired by a dugong, which, yeah, is more closely related to other mammals than it is anything to do with fish. And this is actually the branch of life that I believe that, yes, Slowbro and its Galarian form belong to. If when looking at this creature you guessed the extinct sea manatee called Promasticide, no, I'm saying that wrong, Prorastomicide? Prorastomide? This is what I believe Slowpoke to be inspired by and its evolutionary family, which is quite a big evolutionary family, which will expand when we look to the Johto region. Back on land, though, we also have our carnivorans. These are cats and dogs and bears and wolves. These, of course, include Persian and its Alolan variation. And you might wonder, what about its Galarian variant? Yes, Berserker is also closely related, but officially I'll be dealing with those Pokemon that are deemed as different species when we get to the relevant regions. So yes, there's Persian and its Alolan form. Arcanine is, of course, a dog. It's a canine. And in the fossil record, there's actually a Hisuian variation of this Pokemon that didn't go extinct until not too long ago. And what a shame, because what a cool Pokemon. Closely related to the foxes like Ninetales and Alolan Ninetales, and these very spiritual foxes will come back up again later as a very important part of the evolutionary tree. Also in the world of weasels, there is this odd weasel creature with psychic powers that is known as Alaxalan. It is also a mammal and not too distantly related. Snorlax, which is one of my absolute favorites, is of course inspired by a bear. It's a big mountainous bear that is easy to study when it's asleep, not so much when it's awake, and it's very hungry. And between the dogs and cats of the Pokemon world, there is an evolutionary branch of life that is unique to the Pokemon world. That being these dog, cat, fox creatures, the Evolutions, that are very much their own branch of evolution. In Kanto, this includes, of course, Jolteon, Vaporeon, and Flareon. Despite the wild variation in these creatures and their biology, these 3 Pokemon are obviously very closely related and mark their own branch of life. And that makes sense because Eevee is the poster child for evolution. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and put all the evolutions on this branch now. We, of course, have Sylveon and Glaceon and Leafeon, and then in the Johto region, Umbreon and Espeon. And Espeon is a Pokemon that, based on the unstable DNA of Eevee and its current form, may be the closest living relative to the ancient Pokemon Mew that started this whole thing. But what about Mewtwo? What about the legendary birds? What about ghost and plant Pokemon and more speculative parts of the evolutionary tree? There are other Pokemon of Kanto that simply haven't been mentioned yet. Well, we'll get to them in later parts of this video. For now, though, let's take a hop, skip, and a jump across the border to the Johto region. Now, the Kanto and Johto region are as close to each other as they can possibly geologically be, sharing a thin little border, which is a mountainous range. As a result, the species of Pokemon that are found in Johto are often closely related to those found in the Kanto region. I mentioned earlier Poliwhirl and its potential evolution, which we'll talk about very shortly. But first, there is a creature that I want you to just think about and let me know in the comments what you think this Pokemon is related to, evolutionarily speaking. This is Blissey. It lays eggs like a mammal, but has feathers like a bird. How can a Pokemon like this even exist? Is it a whole branch of the tree of evolution? We will get there, but first let's talk about another member of the Nidaria family, in of course Corsola, the coral Pokemon. And yes, corals in the real world are animals. They're real living species and closely related to jellyfish like Tentacruel. And it's interesting because when you look at Tentacruel and you see all of its, well, tentacles, you might think, isn't it more closely related to things like octopus? But no, octopus are mollusks, and while they are closely related, generally speaking, it is a whole separate branch. In the Pokemon world in Johto, we have Octillery, which is an octopus, and another mollusk is the shelled mollusk, which is Shuckle. And this tree of evolution was actually thought out by the people of the Pokemon world. You can see here now that Shuckle is closely related to Omastar, but Omastar also has a Pokedex entry in Pokemon Sun, likely written by Professor Kukui, that suggests that it is a distant relative of, yeah, Octillery. Roaming Roaming the seas of the Johto region and around the Whirl Islands, we have the bony fish, we have quillfish and lantern, and of course Kingdra, which is a seahorse. However, there is another species of sea life here in the Johto region which is quite unique, and that is Mantine. Mantine, or Mantine depending on your pronunciation, is often seen with a Remoraid under its wing. In fact, the Remoraid helps Mantike evolve into Mantine. This is a sort of symbiotic relationship, like we see here in the real world, where cleaner fish will help other fish in keeping them clean of bacteria in exchange for a free meal. But Remoraid is no fish, it's the larval stage of Octillery, and neither really is Mantine. It's a manta ray, which means it's more closely related to sharks, which are a slightly different group of creatures to the bony fish of the Pokemon world. Right, let's head back on land and have a look at how our Arthropod branch is doing. We have Ariados, which is an arachnid, though not a true arachnid, with only 4 legs, or maybe 6 if you include the things at the back, instead of 8. This is a common trend through spider Pokemon and arachnid Pokemon in the Pokemon world though, so don't worry yourself too much about it. In with the kind of beetles and bugs, we have Heracross, which is a Hercules beetle, and Ledian, which is a ladybug. And I mentioned earlier that all of these Pokemon probably have common ancestry in Kabutops, and this can be seen so clearly in the Pokemon Scyther and its Jotonian evolution, Scizor. Scyther is a great hunter with scythes on its hand, much like Kabutops. However, in modern day, when exposed to a metal coat, it evolves into Scizor, which has a slightly different style of hunting. This idea of using the environment around you to create an exoskeleton can actually be seen in another bug Pokemon of the Johto region, Fortress. Fortress is the evolution of Pineco, and while it looks like a pine cone, that is just an evolutionary technique to disguise itself in the trees of Ilex Forest. It is instead more closely related to like bagworms, like Burmy for example. But Fortress has doubled down on the bagworm stage, being protected in that metal, but that doesn't mean it's any less related to Pokemon like Venomoth and Butterfree. Of course, yes, when it comes to those amphibians, we have Politoed. If you give a Poliwhirl a King's Rock and trade it, it becomes Politoed, which is a split evolution of Poliwrath. They're very closely related. There's also the beautiful, the wonderful, the amazing good boy, Quagsire. And if you know your Pokemon, you know that this is inspired by an axolotl, and it's an amphibian, and they will be coming up again many more times in this evolutionary tree. Just a note on Quagsire here, it's possible that the strongest evolutionary trait that this Pokemon has, the one that's allowed it to survive, not hunted and killed, is the fact that it is the goodest of boys. When we look over to the branch of Reptilia, we get our first look at crocodiles and alligators with Feraligatr, which of course is an alligator. And these are reptiles that are quite closely related to modern day birds. In the real world, crocodiles and alligators are thought of as living dinosaurs, and in the Pokemon world, there are creatures that are more close to what you might think of as a dinosaur, not just birds that exist in modern day. We have Tyranitar, which of course is part of this reptilian dinosaur family, and the Jotostarter Meganium, which is again a living dinosaur. When we look to those other living dinosaurs, we have our birds. We have Delibird and Skarmory, which are both obviously very avian, and we have Xatu and Noctowl, which I think are probably quite closely related. This can be seen when we look to some of the other species of the Pokemon world, but they both have psychic-like qualities. And there is one more flying Pokemon in the world of Johto that when I first discussed this idea, when I first discussed this theory, I'd said that actually I believed it to be more closely related to the reptiles and Aerodactyl, and that is Crobat. But bats in the real world are really based on mammals. The previous theory was suggested on this idea that Crobat and Aerodactyl share a lot of similar traits, which is true, they do. They have the pointy ears, their teeth are similar, their wing structure is exactly the same. It seemed likely that Crobat was the closest living descendant to the Aerodactyl family, but I've changed my mind on this. I think Crobat is simply a flying mammal. This is once again that thing that will come up quite a lot in this series, convergent evolution. The idea that two species that are completely unrelated will evolve similar traits based on the environment that they're in, having similar requirements. Right, speaking of other mammals, we've got Donphan, which is an elephant, and Azumarill, which I think is most closely related to rabbits. And then there's Slowking, which is another one of these sea cows alongside Slowbro. What's interesting to note here is that Slowking also has a regional variant in Galarian Slowking. But now here's a question for you, and I don't know the answer to this. Is Slowbro more closely related to Slowking or Galarian Slowbro? Galarian Slowbro is a Slowbro, like regular Slowbro, but then it's the Galarian form. Is Galarian Slowbro not more closely related to Galarian Slowking? I don't know. I mean, when it comes down to it, the whole evolution of this family of Pokemon is based on the way that Cloyster and Shelder bite onto it and where they bite onto it. So these Pokemon are virtually the same species. While it may not look like it, Ampharos is of course a woolly sheep. Not too far off and related to our whole roster of 4 different Tauros, there is also Miltank. Miltank and Tauros are practically gender variations of each other. You can find them in Alola on the exact same Pokedex page as evolutionary families tend to be. And look, I'm not going to be placing Miltank wrong. Miltank is a terrifying Pokemon that sends me back to a very dark place. So yeah, Miltank, definitely a cow. In the world of ferrets and weasels, we have Furret and Typhlosion. And Typhlosion is an interesting interesting one because there is actually a regional variation that was discovered in textbooks about Old Hisui, the Hisuian Typhlosion. And this Pokemon acts as the gateway to a really interesting Pokemon theory, but we'll get to that. Thanks to research from Professor Elm on Pokemon eggs and baby Pokemon, we learnt of the existence of a Pokemon called Tyrogue, confirming the relationship between Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee, as well as providing a new evolution, Hitmontop. And while there are no cats in the Johto region, there are 3 different species of dogs, Houndoom, Gramble, and Smeargle. Now, there is one more Pokemon that I want to talk about when it comes to mammals, and did you forget? This one, it's Blissey. Blissey, a mammal? Sorry, hang on, it's got a face like a human, feathers like a bird, a pouch like a marsupial, and lays eggs. How is this a mammal? Well, I believe that Blissey is part of a very specific and unique type of life form, a monotreme. And the most famous monotreme that you're probably familiar with is the duck-billed platypus. Platypuses are technically mammals that lay egg, but they're aquatic, and while they're not birds, they have a beak, but they have fur and they can inject poison. It's kind of a mishmash of a number of different traits, and for a creature like Blissey, as to how it would fit on the tree of evolution, this would be my best guess. Oh, platypus also have pouches. Why are platypus so weird? Maybe things get a little less weird in the Hoenn region. Spoiler warning here, it won't get more simple. Life in the Hoenn region has had to evolve in some very niche ecosystems and some very diverse ecosystems. The ocean level rises and changes depending on which local deity is enraged at that time. There's great volcanoes, dense jungles, blistering deserts, and wide oceans, all of which have different forms of life. And in fact, our introduction to the Hoenn region starts with a new form of life that we haven't talked about yet in this series, echinoderms. In the real world, you'll know them for their 5-point radial symmetry and starfish, and while there is a starfish Pokemon, Starmie, its origins may be slightly different. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. In the Hoenn region, there is an ancient fossil, though, a monstrosity that today its fossil can be found actually in a desert and deep underground. Likely these areas used to be oceans, and that Pokemon is Cradily. Cradily is based off of sea lilies, and sea lilies in the real world are in an environment where they are in the bottom of the ocean. They don't have much light, and they can't move in the same way that, well, Cradily can. So I think something different happened with Cradily, and it gave way to an abundance of plant life here in the Pokemon world, but we'll get to that when we start talking about plants. We have another mollusk, of course, in Swalot, which is another non-shelled mollusk, and when we go to the Arthropods, we see another fossil Pokemon, that being Armaldo. All of these fossils of arthropod Pokemon explains why the arthropod tree is just so wide and diverse. There really were that many species in the ancient times as well. In the Hoenn region, we can see Dustox and Beautifly, which are closely related to each other, having both evolved from Wurmple, and of course are related to other moth and butterfly Pokemon. And there's a big bug boy in the Pokemon world, and that is Flygon, which, yeah, I'm placing him with the insects, not the dragons. This is because it evolves from Trapinch, the antlion Pokemon. And I know we weren't typically looking at pre-evolutions here, but if we're not using types as a reliable factor for how these Pokemon evolve from each other, actually when we look to the traits of Flygon, yeah, it is a giant insect. Masquerain is another bug based off of the lanternfly, and then we have Ninjask and Shedinja, which are of course split evolutions of one another and are cicadas. We also have Volbeat and Illumise, which both species of Pokemon are clearly related to each other and are both based off of fireflies. Also in Arthropods, we have the mighty Crawdaunt. This Pokemon is said to actually not originally be from the Hoenn region. It's an invasive species and may have a relationship to another Pokemon that exists in the Hoenn region, that being Sharpedo. Sharpedo is of course a shark and very closely related to manta rays like Mantine, and you can actually see this in their design with the white underbelly and the dark blue overcoat. But also what these creatures have in common is that they have skeletons that aren't made of bones, but are in fact made of cartilage. Sharpedo is a fierce predator, an absolute menace across the waters of the Hoenn region, and it seems likely that Crawdaunt has evolved alongside this Pokemon to mimic its design. You can see the star on Crawdaunt's head, as well as what looks like a big open jaw. This might be so that underwater, for predators or prey that have poor vision, it looks like a Sharpedo coming at them. This evolutionary tactic is called Batian mimicry, and when you see it here, you can't unsee it. Other bony fish in the region include Lovedisk, Wishcash, which is a catfish, and then Gorbis and Huntail. Both Huntail and Gorbis are being classified as eels, though there is some debate with Gorbis as to whether it's a long-nosed chimera, which would be more closely related to a shark, but I'm counting them as eels here. When you look at their pre-evolution Clamperl, you can see that the evolutionary path for these guys has been absolutely huge and very drastic, and it's possible that Clamperl isn't really a clam, but instead the pearl inside the clam is actually something closer to like a fish egg that hatches into these eels. Pokemon evolution's weird. And when it comes to the fish life of the Pokemon world, we have to talk about this species because, oh my goodness, it's such an interesting case, and this is Relicanth. Now, Relicanth is what's known as a living fossil. It's based off of the coelacanth, a species of fish that was thought to be extinct for the longest time, 66 million years in fact, until it just showed up in the 1930s being caught by a fisherman. So what's happening here? Well, wild species diversify and change as their environments change, and only those that are more specialized to their environments manage to pass on their genes and reproduce. Sometimes you just can't fix what isn't broken, and Relicanth is an optimized design. This fish is perfect for its environment with no external pressures acting on it. It just stays pretty much the same. Relicanth clearly has the right idea, and that's how it's become a living fossil. However, some species of creatures obviously left the sea, and that's where we have our amphibians. And if you remember from earlier on, I was talking about Quagsire being the goodest of boys. There's another really good boy. I heard you like Mudkips. Swampert is, yes, absolutely based off of an axolotl and related to Quagsire. If we hop across the tree though and have a look at some of our reptiles, well, we've got Kecleon, which is a chameleon, that's a lizard, and we've got Seviper, which is of course a snake, very closely related to Arbok. And then there's Sceptile, which I think fits in more with like the dinosaur-like Pokemon of the Pokemon world. While Trico is more like your regular gecko, Sceptile is more raptor-like. It's a lot more fierce, and there are other grass-living dinosaurs in Tropius, which is clearly related, of course, to Meganium. These two Pokemon go hand in hand and are clearly very close cousins. Torkoal, of course, is a tortoise, and when we look to the tree of Draconis, we see Milotic, a Pokemon that is absolutely a relative of Gyarados. When we look to their larval stage, they are almost identical, almost like regional variations. In fact, it could be that you would imagine regional variants, traditionally, that these Pokemon were once considered the same, and they are now different enough to be qualified as their own species. It seems that the evolutionary strategy for this Pokemon, by the way, and for this evolutionary family, it's one of my favorite to think about in the Pokemon world. Magikarp is found pretty much everywhere across the Pokemon world. When you live everywhere, you're food for everyone. And you might think that's a terrible evolutionary strategy, but it's important to note that survival of the fittest is not about survival of the individual fittest species. If that was the case, every Pokemon would be a Dragonite or an Eternatus. But it seems very likely that the evolutionary strategy of Feebas and Milotic is that they are both social and cooperative species that work together. Large amounts of Magikarp reproduce with the lowest egg cycle possible. This means that yes, they're food for everyone, but they just keep on reproducing, and all it takes is for one to evolve into the mighty Gyarados to defend the nest of Magikarp. However, the evolutionary strategy for Feebas here is to look, and forgive me Feebas, I love you, I think you're amazing, to look kind of gross, because if it looks gross, maybe another predator Pokemon won't consider eating it. However, because the wild Feebas and Milotic that there are ultimately reproducing with Magikarp and Gyarados, and Magikarp and Gyarados are just so numerous, it means that the Feebas DNA is sort of getting filtered out a little bit, which again adds to the scarcity and rarity of this creature. Now, when we look at other draconic Pokemon of the Hoenn region, we have to look to Meteor Falls, the home of dragons, where we find Salamence, a true dragon. Definitely closely related to the likes of Charizard and Dragonite. And there's a new type of living dinosaur out there, that being the Pokemon Aggron. You might think that, hang on, isn't Aggron more closely related to something like Nidoking or Nidoqueen? But no, there is a Pokemon in the next generation that kind of ties into Aggron and paints this picture a little bit better. So for now, just think of it more like Tyranitar. Now, living dinosaurs out the way, let's talk about those birds. Of course, we have Pelipper, which appears all over the skies of Hoenn, and more rarely, but beautifully, is Altaria, one of my favorite bird Pokemon. There is also the starter Pokemon Blaziken, which is ultimately based off of a Shamo chicken. And yeah, this is a chicken. As I mentioned in previous episodes, its pre-evolution Torchic has a flame sac, which is how it's able to navigate the fire within it without becoming roast chicken. There's also a quite curious Pokemon here, which is Ludicolo. You might think it's closely related to a pineapple, but I think it's more closely related to a duck. Just look at that happy smile on that big beak. And Swallow is a swallow. Coming back down to the ground though, we have those mammal-like Pokemon. We have the human-like Pokemon in Hariyama and Metachan, which are obviously very closely related to the likes of Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee. There's actually another great ape Pokemon, and that is Slacking. Slacking is one of those Pokemon that is really inspired by two creatures. It's either a giant sloth or it is an ape. And I wanted to put it as a sloth because we don't have a sloth Pokemon otherwise, but I actually think it's more closely related to the apes for a reason I will get onto much later in this video. With the marsupials, we have Breloom, which is based off of a kangaroo, but it is covered in mushroom-like spores, an interesting evolutionary tactic. And of course, there is the biggest mammal of them all, the creature that has returned to the sea, the Cetaceans. And this is, of course, what Whale Lord is inspired by. Whale Lord is no fish. Whale Lord restored is mammal life returned to the ocean and optimized for that environment. These creatures don't have gills, they don't breathe water, they have lungs, they breathe air, they surface and take that air in. However, just because they breathe air doesn't mean they're any good on land anymore. With those giant fins, no, they're designed for the ocean. And if you want to know what a whale would really look like on land, then look no further than their closest living cousins, the hippopotamus, which for those of you who of course know your Pokemon know that in the Sinnoh region there is such a Pokemon. Now, other closely related Pokemon, we have Camerupt, which is a camel, Grumpig, which is a pig, and Walrein, which is a walrus, and similar to whales, has returned to live into ocean life, but yeah, it is a mammal. In Carnivora, we have Linoon, and in with cats, we have both Absol, which we've decided I think is more feline than it is canine, and Mightyena, based off of the hyena, which is more closely related actually to cats than they are to dogs. There's also a more traditional cat in Delcatty, there's the bear Pokemon, Spinder, and the mongoose Pokemon, Zangoose, which is in a fierce rivalry with Seviper. These two Pokemon battling it out across the ages and across environments. Now let's take a little look back at the rodents, and there is something really interesting here. Plusle and Minun. Obviously these Pokemon are closely related, and it's easy to see that they're probably closely related to Pikachu, or in this case, the Raichus. However, across the entirety of Pokemon, there are lots of these electric rodent Pokemon with electric pouches on their cheek, which I do believe are closely related to one another. However, they're all based off of different animals which are more separated on the evolutionary tree. So much like with the evolutions, I believe this to be its own branch of life. In fact, I'm going to sort of throw all of these on here now. Pachirisu, Emolga, Dedenne, Togedemaru, Morpeko, and Pawmot are all part of the same evolutionary family, despite all being slightly different creatures. And no, Mimikyu is not biologically related to them. Sorry, Mimikyu. I almost forgot to mention there is an electric canine that exists in the Hoenn region as well, and that is the mighty Manectric. There is one species of mammal, though, that is incredibly hard to place. Its biology does not match anything that we see here in the real world, and that is the Pokemon Exploud. For the first time in this entire series, I am going to have to look to the pre-evolutions for some kind of indication as to what this Pokemon is based off of, and the best answer I can find is rabbits, when you look to Whismur. But Exploud, yeah, not matching a whole lot of things that we see in real-world biology. We're gonna have to get a little bit of fanciful as we go through the series. Whew, and that's the Hoenn region, and yeah, we're only a third of the way through the regions that there are, and then there's all of this bonus stuff like ghosts and plants and legendary Pokemon and humans. We will get to it all, but as you pull back, you begin to see the evolutionary tree forming with all of its different branches of life. Now, when it comes to the Sinnoh region, or Hisui as it was known in the not too distant past, there are all sorts of species of Pokemon that appear. Now, Sinnoh is really interesting as a place. It's cold and harsh and inhospitable. It's got a whole mountain range. In fact, in the grand underground below the region, there are all sorts of species of Pokemon and evolutions to Pokemon that also exist on this same sort of Japanese Pokemon continent. Some of these can be a little confusing though. Take Magmortar and Electivire. We'll go through the Pokemon of Sinnoh bit by bit, branch by branch, and see what we can't work out. So, starting off with like the mollusks. There is only one form of mollusk, although it has two forms, and that is Gastrodon, that appears differently in the east and west of the region. So I wonder what a Gastrodon would look like if it existed in the dead center of the region on the top of Mount Cornet. It's interesting though, because Gastrodon can be found all across the Pokemon world, and it's not like all of the regions are on a central line around the planet. So whether these are actually east and west forms is up for debate. According to its Pokedex entries though, Gastrodon used to have a very hard shell, so you can see how it'd be related to Pokemon like Omastar. When we look to the Arthropods, we have Vespiquen, which is very closely related to Beedrill, being a queen bee. We've got Kricketot, which of course is a cricket, putting it closely related to the likes of Scizor, and then we have Mothim and Wormadam. We already mentioned Bagworms when it came to the like of Fortress, and of course Mothim is amongst those moth Pokemon. Drapion is not related to anything we've previously seen before, but I suspect it of course to be a close living relative to the likes of Gliscor. These Pokemon look very similar in their biology, are both clearly arthropods. And even though Gliscor isn't a poison type or anything, it has the poison heal ability. Additionally, Drapion is based off of an arachnid, a scorpion, and you can see those scorpion-like traits in Gliscor. These Pokemon were clearly related and came up together in the Cornet Highlands. Also in the branch of arthropods, we have Yanmega. Now, Yanmega is a giant dragonfly, and is the evolution of Yanma. And we actually see this with Yanma flying about the place regularly in the days of Hisui. There are actually a number of Pokemon in the Sinnoh region that tie into this. We'll talk about Tangrowth in a future episode, episode, but Mamoswine is very, very interesting. It's a mammal, and sorry to jump across the tree here, but I definitely want to put a special note on this Pokemon, for it is no mammoth. And when I say mammoth, I mean it is mammoth in that it is big, but it's not a mammoth in that it's related to elephants or anything like that. It is Mamoswine, a mammoth pig, a swine. This can be clearly seen in its pre-evolution Swinub and Piloswine, and once again can be seen roaming the Alabaster Icelands in the days of Hisui. We have another somewhat forgettable fish in Luminion, and then we have another shark, and that is Garchomp. You might think, shark? Really? And this is much how, like, Flygon is a bug. It is literally known as the land shark Pokemon, and look at its design. The star on the head, the blue back of this creature, the rough skin ability. This Pokemon is related to Sharpedo. They even share shiny forms, and you might think, hang on, Garchomp's shiny form is quite boring. Look at its Mega Evolution. Both the Mega Evolutions for Sharpedo and Garchomp have a thing for spikes. They've both got the same jagged teeth. Heck, even Garchomp's wings are really fins. This Pokemon absolutely came from the sea. When it comes to the amphibians, though, we have just one here, and that is Toxicroak, which is a poison dart frog and related to the other frogs of the Pokemon world. Looking at the family of Reptilia, we have Licky Licky, which based on its long tongue is likely related to the likes of like Kecleon. You also have Torterra, which is half ankylosaur, half tortoise. For this, I'm going to be putting it as a tortoise rather than a sort of living dinosaur, but if you put it with an ankylosaur, I wouldn't blame you. And speaking of dinosaurs, we have fossils. Fossils for Rampardos, another dinosaur-like Pokemon, and Bastiodon, which is the Pokemon that I think is most closely related, actually, to Aggron. At first, you might think they're unrelated, but look at their larval stages. Aron and Shieldon. These Pokemon are virtually identical. Both of these Pokemon have similar typings, they both have the sturdy ability, and both of them have Pokedex entries talking about their diets, with Shieldon eating berries and Aron eating metal. It seems likely that this is a dietary change that happened as the introduction of cities and metals became more common in the modern age. Of course, all of these dinosaur-like Pokemon are the ancestors of modern-day birds, and there's a bunch more here in the Sinnoh region as well. We have Honchkrow, which is the evolution to Murkrow and is a crow. Staraptor, where again you can hear it in the name, Raptor. It's got that raptor-like quality. Chatot, which of course is a parrot, which is going to be super interesting later on, and Empoleon, which is a penguin, much like Delibird. I also want to place Magmortar here in with the birds. While when you look to its pre-evolution Magmar, there's more of a debate as to whether it's like a lizard when you look at its tail. I think the beak for me sells it as a bird. It is admittedly a hard Pokemon to place on a tree of evolution that's biological. It is quite an interesting form, so if you have different thoughts, let me know in the comments down below. But you know, just looking at its arms, those could well be the leftovers of feathers around the edge. Plus, when we looked at Ludicolo, we already knew the ducks of this world were kind of odd. They're a little bit far-fetched. In the world of rodents, we have our first bunny, clearly in Lopunny, and we've got Bibarel, which is a beaver. There is the rhino Pokemon, Rhyperior, which is clearly closely related to Nidoking and Nidoqueen, and again, Rhydon is a big part of Giovanni's team in Generation 1. I do wonder if there's a relationship between, like, Rhydon and cloning of Nidoqueen, if that theory is true. And Hippowdon is, of course, that hippo Pokemon that I mentioned before. Hippos being the species of mammal that is closest to whales. Now, when we hop over to Carnivora, which is a big part of the mammal tree, we see Floatzel and Skuntank, but we also see another Pokemon here, Weavile. Weavile exists in modern day all over the Sinnoh region, but back in the days of Hisui, there was a split evolution to Sneasel, that being Sneasler. Sneasler seems to have gone completely extinct, likely because it didn't have the hunting tactics that Weavile does. You could see in Weavile's Pokedex entry, it talks about cooperative hunting, and it seems like this non-solo play, this team way of being allowed Weavile to thrive, where Sneasler fell to the wayside. And thank goodness, because I did not like Sneasler. While we're taking a pause here to talk about old Hisui, you may have noticed in the portion about Johto, I completely skipped Ursaring, and that's because Ursaring has a true evolution in Ursaluna. It's just that we can't seem to evolve our Ursaring's that way anymore. Ursaluna is, of course, a bear. However, when recently exploring the Kitakami region, an area was discovered, the Timeless Woods, that features both White-Striped Basculin and Basculegion, as well as a single species of Ursaluna that has survived, so maybe it's possible that these Pokemon might continue to appear elsewhere in the Pokemon world. There's also an evolution to a regional variation of Quillfish called Overquill that's unique to the Hisui region. This version of Quillfish and Overquill, though, has gone completely extinct. Another fish that's unique to the Hisui region is Basculegion. In modern day, Basculin can be found all over the Pokemon world, and we'll talk about those later, but Basculegion is exclusive to Hisui, and it seems as a result of a really poor evolutionary strategy has died out. That evolutionary strategy being that it's made up of the souls of dead white-striped Basculin. Lots of Basculin come together to create this Pokemon, and it requires those Pokemon Pokemon's deaths. That's a poor evolutionary strategy. Additionally, there's Weirdeer. Weirdeer is the evolution to Stantler, and you can only find Stantler nowadays across the Pokemon world. Weirdeer used to exist and actually be a very popular Pokemon in the days of Hisui. However, it's possible due to hunting for their antlers, which can be seen as decorations around the Galaxy Expedition team's halls, that Stantler was incentivized to not evolve and have bigger, more impressive horns. The evolutionary strategy that worked for Stantler was simply not evolving, which is quite sad. Anyway, nonetheless, Weirdeer is a deer. It's part of mammal life. Now, there's actually evidence of a really interesting arthropod in the Hisui region, and that is Kleavor. And this says so much about Scyther's evolution over time. So Scyther, according to its Pokédex entries, was said to live in the mountains. We knew that it was a great predator, a great hunter the whole time. So whatever creatures it ate, clearly what they ate had certain minerals in their diet. In modern days, that might be metal that's ingested by its prey, and that metal ultimately turns the Scyther into a scissor when it evolves, giving it the metal coat. But back in the days of Hisui, those minerals that Scyther's prey fed off of, well, its prey fed off the black augurite, which turned Scyther into Kleavor. And what's really even more interesting is then the stone tools that Kleavor could create and shed from itself were used by humans of the Hisui era. So this Pokemon really coexisted alongside people, and likely as a result of human interference and using those stone tools that was made from black augurite disappeared from the world, ultimately meaning now Scyther couldn't evolve until once again in the modern age it could evolve into Scizor. Sorry for the sidetrack there, I just found all my files from Professor Lavington. There is so much interesting information about the days of Hisui. I wonder if any of the other Pokemon regions were named different regions in the ancient past, and if there's regional variants out there that we have yet to discover. Back in the branches of Carnivora, we have the jackal Pokemon Lucario, based on a dog, and when it comes to the cats, we've got Purugly and Luxray, a wild cat that lives all across Sinnoh. And closely related to this Pokemon and cats is where I want to put Electivire. I get it, it might be hard to see this Pokemon as a cat. There's a lot of decision as to whether this is like a cat or is this like a great ape. There's a lot that you could weigh up. My favorite art for this Pokemon though, and for Electabuzz in particular, is by Carryfly, which depicts this as a tiger, and it makes so much sense. And in a region where Luxray are everywhere, I see this relative making sense as a cat. But again, if you disagree, let me know in the comments. Magmortar and Electivire really are a strange pair. Speaking of great apes though, you might think about Ambipom and Infernape, but these aren't true apes because they have tails. I mean, literally in Ambipom's case, 2 tails. So neither are apes, they are more like monkeys, though closely related. Now, I know when it comes to the mythos of the Sinnoh region, there's a bunch of other strange creatures that are talked about above Spear Pillar. They're well documented, and these legends and myths, we'll get to them. But there are still many more regions to explore. So let's head on over to the most industrious of the Pokemon regions, the one with the biggest Pokedex, and one where new discoveries are being made every single day. Of course, it's the Unova region. Professor Juniper has given me a lot of information with Pokemon species that are both modern and evolved in urban environments to those dating back to ancient times. First up, we have another of the Nidaria, and in this case, it is Jellicent. Jellicent is a Pokemon where you can really see the sexual dimorphism of the Pokemon in its species on display, with its variations looking very, very different. There are Pokedex entries talking about how Frillish, its pre-evolution, are actually dead people, and that kind of thing does come up in the Pokedex a lot. We are going to talk about ghosts a little bit later, but for now, I'm placing this in with the jellyfish of the Pokemon world. I suspect Jellicent is a natural result of evolution. In the branch of Arthropods, we have Crustle, which you can see how it might be closely related to something like Kingler, there's Scolipede, and then of course there is Galvantula, which is yet again another arachnid. Durant is most definitely an ant and the victim to both Trapinch and Heatmore, this generation's anteater, which is a sort of mammal. We'll get there. Leavanny is some sort of mantis, with Volcarona being a mega moth. Volcarona replacing the sun in ancient times. This Pokemon is very nearly the stuff of myth and legend, but I believe it's just a regular big old moth. Now, there are a couple Pokemon bugging me here. We've got a Selgor and Excavalier, and these Pokemon, much like I mentioned right back at the beginning with Machamp and Golem, seem to swap DNA when they evolve. But looking at pre-evolutions, I would say that the Selgor is a mollusk and Excavalier is a beetle of some kind. Maybe they've somehow swapped DNA? I really don't know how that works with the Tree of Evolution. Heading on to the fish, we actually have the shark-like jawless fish things with Electros, which is more closely related to the likes of Mantine and Garchomp and Sharpedo than it is the other fish. Stunfisk and its Galarian variant are both flat fish, closely related to the likes of Wishcash, while Basculin is clearly related to the aforementioned Basculegion, and let's try that again. Alola clearly closely related to Lovedis. How this Pokemon is not this other Pokemon's like regular evolution is beyond me. So yeah, let's make it official. These Pokemon are related. Other aquatic life exists in the form of the amphibians, and we see some symmetry between Generation 5 and Generation 1 with Seismitoad, which is very closely related to the likes of Poliwrath. If you don't believe me, just look at Timepole and Poliwag. In Reptilia, we have Superior, which is joining the snakes, and I'm going to put Scrafty in with the lizard. There's something very lizard-like about it, and it has the shed skin ability. Draconis come up again in this generation with Haxorus, Hydreigon, and Druidigon. And then, of course, we have turtles, and the inspiration behind this whole series. The very first video that I did about evolution, the connective tissue between Lapras and Squirtle. There is a fossil for Pokemon Tirtuga, and as I've explained it on the channel before, this represents Pokemon evolution absolutely perfectly. Imagine, if you will, two groups of Tirtuga many years ago separating and going in different directions. One out to the deep ocean, where the ability to swim far and use your neck to grab prey was beneficial. The creatures with longer necks were more likely to reproduce and would have one day, of course over millions of years, evolved into becoming Lapras. Meanwhile, a number of them ended up beached on an island somewhere, and the ability to walk on land and use the little nubs on the end of your flippers as fingers might turn into being advantageous, allowing you to reach additional food. That trait passed down over the generations and accentuated with those with the trait more strongly and profoundly, being more beneficial towards the creature's survival, ultimately would turn them into the likes of the Squirtle evolutionary family. Of course, in this series, we're talking about Caracosta, and it's not just an ancestor to these Pokemon, it's an ancestor to all tortoise and turtle Pokemon. That's including Torkoal and Torterra. And actually, Caracosta has Pokedex entries talking about how its jaw is so strong it could crush through Omastar's shells, so I guess that's the predator that made Omastar go extinct. And this kind of origin, this ancestor, can also be seen for bird Pokemon. In fact, for all of bird Pokemon and Reptilia and for dragons. We see this in the Pokemon Archeops, which is based on the real-world Archaeopteryx, a real common ancestor between all of these different creatures. Well, not dragons. Again, dragons real-world not exist. But this is the creature that proved to the world that, yeah, modern-day birds really are just dinosaurs. You can see all of the dinosaur-like traits and all of the bird-like traits. This is the idea that if you took a modern-day bird and a modern-day lizard and you went back far enough through their ancestry, eventually you come to a creature that is both and neither of those species. That is what Archeops is. It's so interesting to me that the Unova region has these fossils that seem to be gateways to all sorts of Pokemon life, and that the Unova region just has so many of species of Pokemon living in it. These fossils are found in a desert area of the Unova region, which is really interesting because it's in the middle of the region, suggesting that perhaps there was an ocean there once. I would love to know about the history of the Unova region. So yeah, we have Archeops, which is right at that turning point where reptiles became birds. Oh, also, Archeops also has Pokedex entries talking about how it used to bite into Omastar. Poor Omastar. There's a whole bunch of birds in the Unova region. There's Unpheasant and Mandibuzz, Braviary, and a Hisuian form of Braviary has been discovered in colder climates. There's also Sigilif, which I know doesn't seem like a bird, but actually when you put it close to the other owls and psychically powered birds of the Pokemon world, you can sort of see how a Pokemon like this might be related to the likes of Xatu. There's also Swano, which is of course a swan, and closely related to the birds is those reptiles, the alligators and crocodiles, and this is where we see Crocodile, one of my favorite Pokemon ever, and definitely a cousin to the likes of Fraligator. Crocodile is super interesting as well. It's a cooperative hunter. According to Pokedex, it works alongside Flygon, who creates sandstorms with its wing, which this Pokemon uses as a sort of shade to move around and head towards its prey, and then it splits the bounty with Flygon. This is a perfect example of survival of the fittest not being about the survival of the fittest and strongest individual, but rather about cooperative play. And not just within your own species. This kind of interspecies cooperation, it's rare, but it does happen in nature. Then we're on to mammalian life, where we see Swoobat as a close relative, of course, to Crobat, another bat and the only other bat Pokemon. Sorcathrow joined the Great Ape branch and are clearly closely related to the likes of Hitmontop, Hitmonchan, and Hitmonlee. Conkeldurr is also among them. Then there are the three elemental monkeys, probably my least favorite Pokemon ever, Simisear, Simisage, and Simipour. You didn't need to know that. That doesn't really help with your education of the Pokemon world. Just know that I dislike them. And look at that, another fire ape Pokemon in Darmanitan. Darmanitan, of course, also has a Galarian variation that can be found in the Galar region, which is closely related. Chinsino is also a rodent, and there is Watchog, which is based off of a groundhog. And we get a new cat in Carnivora with Lipard. There's a new bear with Beartick, and Stoutland is a dog and a Pokemon that I love. There is also the dog-like, fox-like Pokemon Zoroark, which I'm going to put closely related to the likes of Ninetales. Zoroark is an illusion-y Pokemon. There's also a Hisuian variant of this Pokemon, and you can see how this Pokemon might be closely related to the likes of Alolan Ninetales. These Pokemon all have mystic-like qualities. I believe all of them to be close relatives of one another. Also closely related are the weasels, where we have Mian Xiao, and we have Samurott and its Hisuian variation as well, which the Hisuian variation is so close to the regular Unovan variant that they may as well just be the same Pokemon. We do have a few more mammals, like Embor, which is of course a pig, and then Sawsbuck, which is obviously closely related to the likes of Weirdeer. Bufalon are bison, and are probably also part of that same branch that gave us Miltank and the 4 different forms of Tauros. Zebstriker is a zebra, and closely related to horses, and then we've got Excadrill, which is a mole, much like Dugtrio and a lowland Dugtrio. And actually, we do have a Pokemon that's kind of like a sloth. We've got, as I mentioned before, Heatmor, which is a mammal, and a mammal that's closely related to, yeah, the likes of sloths. And then for now, we have one final Generation 5 Pokemon, which is Marshuna, a Pokemon that I struggle to pronounce. And it is a psychic tapir that feasts off of dreams / gives dreams to other people. In that way, it's clearly very much like Hypno. And that is the biggest Pokedex of the Pokemon worlds done. Professor Juniper would be proud. But next, I want to look not to Professor Sycamore, but actually to Professor Kikui over in the Alola region. For Alola is one of the many states of the North American Pokemon region. And based on its location, its environment is sort of a crossover between that you might find in the Unova region and those that you might find in the Japanese parts of the Pokemon world. So let's talk about the islands of Alola. Now, because of its environment, the Alola region is really interesting. And we get to visit a form of life that we actually haven't visited since we went to the tropical Hoenn region, that being echinoderms. And here we see Pyukumuku and Toxapex, which are both part of this family. Looking at the arthropods, we have a giant crab in Crabrominable, and we have Golisopod, one of my favorite Pokemon of all time, clearly closely related to the likes of Armaldo. There is Araquanid, which is an arachnid, obviously. Rimbombi, which is used to fighting for territory with Butterfree, and Vikavolt, which is of course a beetle. And again, very cool. The bugs of the Alola region, really cool. And according to Pokedex entries, and this is so interesting, well, normally in the wild Pinsir and Heracross fight, in the Alola region, they actually team up to fight off Vikavolt. In the world of Bonyfish, we have Wishiwashi, which can school in massive forms and change their shape, and Bruxish, which has incredibly sharp teeth. In the family of amphibians, we actually have Salazzle, which at first might appear to you to look like a lizard, but actually it's a salamander, which makes it an amphibian. Again, it's evolved to look like lizards, and that's another form of convergent evolution. But biologically speaking, this Pokemon is a salamander and therefore an amphibian. If you want to look at some true reptiles in the Alola region, sure, we got Turtonator, which is clearly closely related to the likes of Torkoal. Drampa, whose serpentine body kind of reminds me of the Dragonite evolutionary line, and it being a true dragon absolutely lives in that zone. And then there's the dragon, the mighty Komodo, who is this region's pseudo-legendary. And moving up to the worlds of birds, we have Toucanon, Decidueye, and of course its Hisuian form, and then Oricorio, which comes in 4 different variations across the Alolan Islands. This is so interesting to me, and actually will tie back into a Pokemon that appears a little bit later on in Paldea. There's a really interesting Pokemon in the branches of mammal life, a marsupial specifically, and that is Kamala. Based off of a koala, it has a Pokedex entry that sort of suggests that the Pokemon might actually be a log. Yeah, we're not looking into that for this. The biology of this Pokemon very much is that of a sleeping koala. Mudsdale, of course, is a mighty horse, placing it closely related to the likes of Rapidash and Galarian Rapidash, and then there's Gumshoos, which is a mongoose much like Zangoose. Interestingly enough, Gumshoos is not native to the Alola region. It was brought in to deal with a Rattata problem, which forced the Rattata to only hunt at night, which is what ultimately changed their variation into a lowland Rattata. Maybe one day we'll get to see what region Gumshoos is from. Looking at Carnivora, we have 1 cat, 1 dog, and 1 bear. These are Incineroar for the cats, Lycanroc for the dogs, and Beware for the bears. Primarina then, one of our starters, is of course based off of a sea lion, which means it's closely related to the likes of Dugong, Walrein, and the Samurotts. And we have 2 more mammals in Oranguru and Persimmon. And you can see how these Pokemon would be related. They share a lot of design traits, but additionally in the Alolan Pokedex, they share a page together, much like evolutionary families do, suggesting how closely related they are. I wonder if by any chance them being version exclusives to Sun and Moon suggest that evolution would take a different path depending on what version of the game you're playing. Oranguru, though, however, might actually also be very closely related to the likes of Darmanitan, which is again an orangutan, much like Oranguru. Neither of them have tails. They're very similar in their design structure, and Oranguru is all about meditation, as is the Zen mode Darmanitan. And that does it for now for the Alolan Pokedex. I know what you're thinking, aren't there way more creatures in Alola? There are, and don't worry, we will absolutely cover them. But first, we need to look to the European Pokemon continent, where we see the Kalos region, the Galar region, and the newly discovered Paldea region, and the Pokemon life forms that originate from that side of the planet. The first of these is the Kalos region, and this is the smallest of these Pokedexes. And for this region, let's start with the mammals and make our way down to the likes of of mollusks and echinoderms. Starting with Diggersby, a bunny rabbit which is clearly related to the likes of Lopunny. Look at those big powerful ears of both species of Pokemon. Chestnut, much like Sandslash and Alolan Sandslash, is an ancient form of pangolin. And heading over to the branch of felines, we have two species of Pokemon here, both of which have wild sexual dimorphism clearly on display. We have Esper's evolution Meowstic in its two variations. This is a psychic cat Pokemon, again maybe sharing a lot of similar DNA with Espeon, Espeon, I could see it. And then of course there is Pyroar. This Pokemon has very different manes depending on its sex. Additionally, this Pokemon is very closely related to the likes of Incineroar, and you can see that in their pre-evolutions basically sharing a name with Litten and Litleo. Pangoro is based on a bear, and Furfrou, with its many furry looks, of course is a dog. And then there's Gogo, which is a goat, which means it's closely related to the likes of Ampharos. We also have Delphox, which of course is a fox, but I find it so interesting that it kind of, much like Zoroark, much like Ninetales, not only is it a fire fox like Ninetales, but it also has this kind of spiritual nature to it, of witchcraft and magic. There's a whole family here, and actually when you look to Shiny Fennekin and Shiny Ninetales, you can really see there's a relationship there. Moving down the tree, we have Greninja, and this ninja frog, you can see how it would be closely related to the likes of Toxicroak. Reptiles include the basilisk lizard Helialis, and then in the living dinos, or I suppose not living dinos anymore, the fossil dino, we have Tyrantrum. It's clearly a T-Rex. And look, you can even see the feathers on this Pokemon, because again, dinosaurs and birds, they're the same thing. Aurorus, with its incredible sails on display, is not too dissimilar to Meganium and its giant flower, and you can see how this Pokemon would be related to the likes of Meganium and Tropius. And a friend finally for Aerodactyl, another wyvern Pokemon, Noivern. We have some birds with Hawlucha and Talonflame, as well as the flightless bird Aromatisse. I'm going with bird on this one, just look at that beak-like face. Just don't look at anything else. Moving on, we have but a single fish Pokemon, and that is Dragalge, which is obviously a close relative of the likes of Kingdra. It is a dragon seahorse Pokemon. We actually learned in Alola that this Pokemon gets on pretty well with Delmise, because it hides within that Pokemon seaweed. Down in the Arthropods, we have another butterfly/moth, and that is Vivillon, and all of its variations that appear all across the Pokemon world, which it's just not that too dissimilar to regional variants of the Arbok hood patterns that we've already mentioned. Other Arthropods include Barbaracle, which is a barnacle, and Clawitzer. And Clawitzer is really interesting. It's got one of those shiny Pokemon where it looks like a regular red lobster here in our world, but did you know in our world you can get blue lobsters? It's like finding a shiny Pokemon. It's exceptionally rare, and it's just the reverse of what's going on with Clawitzer right here. Then we have another mollusk, and actually our first squid here in the form of Malamar. Squids are really interesting creatures that can even fly outside of the water for short periods of time. And there's a big mollusk of this generation which also has a regional variation, and that is Goodra. Yeah, this ain't no dragon. Much like we've mentioned before with Garchomp and Flygon, this Pokemon, not a dragon. It belongs in the world of its particular species, the mollusks. And you can see this in the Hisuian variant where it still has its shell. Do you remember at the very beginning of the video I mentioned that some mollusks are shelled and some are non-shelled? Well, Goodra and its Hisuian variant are both. And yeah, that's a short Pokedex. The Kalos region doesn't have that many new species of life, but don't worry, as we move further on to the Galar region across the English Channel, we'll find a bunch of new species. And when it comes to Nidaria, there's a particularly interesting new Pokemon here. Galarian Corsola's evolution, Cursula. Corsola's Pokedex entries in Galar originally indicated that it was a dead version of Corsola. And a long time ago, I thought on the evolutionary tree that ghosts belonged on the tree in a way that they were sort of their own evolutionary tree. That ghosts and spirits were the stuff of kind of mythos and fantasy. But Galarian Cursula proves that even though considered a dead Corsola, its closest relative is still Corsola. And so it belongs on the evolutionary tree as do all other ghost Pokemon. I will be doing a full section on that after we get through these regions. In the world of echinoderms, we have Pecharunt, which is like closely related to the likes of Pyukumuku, and when it comes to mollusks, there's also just one new one, Grapploct, which is related to Octillery. For arthropods, we have Orbeetle and Liedin are definitely closely related. Not only are they both ladybugs, they also both seem to have their connections to space, with Liedin being a sort of space soldier and Orbeetle being a giant spaceship. Centiskorch is an arthropod and closely related to the likes of Drapion. In fact, there are shared Pokedex entries talking about how these Pokemon are related. And then Frostmoth is clearly closely related to the likes of Volcarona. This is so interesting to me because I don't understand why these Pokemon aren't just regional variants of each other. I also adore Frostmoth. We have just one new bony fish in Barrascuda, and when it comes to the amphibians, we have two very interesting ones. Toxtricity, which clearly is some kind of frog, and you can see statues of it by the lighthouse. But also we have Dragapult, which is once again just one of those dragon Pokemon that isn't truly a dragon. It's based on a form of extinct amphibian, and so amphibians is where it belongs. When we look to the reptile tree, we see the starter Pokemon Inteleon, which of course is a lizard, Dreadnought, which is a tortoise, and just looking at it, you can tell it's related to the likes of Caracosta and Blastoise. Also in with the dragons, we have Flapple and Appleton, and of course their brand new relative. These Pokemon are technically based off of worms, as in worm, the kind of dragon, but they're not worms like worms. And when it comes to snakes, we have one new one with Sandaconda. In avian life, there's Corviknight, which is a corvid, Cramorant, which I think is probably quite closely related to the likes of Pelipper, Sirfetch'd, which is of course closely related to Farfetch'd, and Ice-Cube, a penguin, which gives us our third penguin next to Delibird and Empoleon. And as always, there are more mammals than anything else. Rillaboom is our only great ape, Cinderace, a rabbit like Lopunny and Diggersby. We've got Greedent, which is of course a giant squirrel. We've got Thievul, which is a red fox, much like Ninetales pre-evolution Vulpix. I think it's probably related to Ninetales, and the fact that they are fire foxes and the fireworks element of Thievul's design makes me think that Thievul is related. We've got Obstagoon, which is obviously most closely related to Linoon, and as I mentioned way back, we've got Berserker. Berserker is of course most closely related to the Persians of the Pokemon world, including the Alolan form. It's interesting to me that there is so much diversity when it comes to the Meowth line, meaning that they've been adopted all over the Pokemon world in a number of different environments. We've got Bolton, the electric dog, which is probably quite closely related to Manectric, and then two new kind of goat sheep things in that area, Dubwool and Indeedee. And then finally, there is another elephant Pokemon joining the fray, which is Copperaja, obviously closely related to Donphan. It's a small little island, that Galar region. Let's head on over to the main continent and see what's going on in Paldea. When we hit the mainland of the Paldea region, we learn that there are no new Nidaria or echinoderm forms that exist, but instead there are a whole bunch of other species. In Arthropods, the Spidops is a spider, Lokix is a cricket, Rabska is of course a scarab, much like Heracross, and Clorf is a brand new crab, and you can see how it would be related to Kingler. If you take a look at Orthworm, you might be tempted to think that it's a snake or a giant worm. What is a worm? Is that an insect? No, it is a mollusk, and that's what Orthworm is. There is also our first ever example here, and this is really exciting, of convergent evolution sort of confirmed by the scientists of the Pokemon world, Wugtrio. People at first thought, yeah, this is a regional variation of Dugtrio, in which case it would be a mole, but it's clearly not a mole. Instead, it is an eel more closely related to the likes of Electros. This Pokemon has evolved traits to look like the Dugtrios of the Pokemon world, because that is an evolutionary strategy that has worked frequently, but clearly in different environments. While we're in the oceans as well, we have Dondozo, Tatsugiri, and the Veluza, which all belong in the realm of bony fish. Dondozo and Tatsugiri have this really wonderful relationship where they work together to protect one another to hunt down prey. For the reptiles, we have another crocodile in Skellydirge, joining Crocodile and Fraligator. Dundunspars is a snake, and it's nice to finally get to mention it, because I felt like I missed it out in Johto. And there is Baxcalibur, a member of the family Draconis. There's also Cyclizar, and you might be wondering, well, what about Miraidon and Koraidon? But remember, those Pokemon are not evolutions of Cyclizar, they are paradox forms, and we will talk all about legendary Pokemon, paradox Pokemon, and Ultra Beasts a little bit later on. Just one new amphibian joins in, and that is Bellybolt. And this Pokemon is so clearly related to Seismitoad. You can see how Seismitoad has the little bumps all over its body, which are much like the ones on Bellybolt. Seismitoad even has Pokedex entries talking about how it can paralyze opponents. And whoa, I almost forgot, the good boy from Johto, Quagsire, has a relative, it's Clodsire. When it comes to avian life, there's a whole flock of new creatures that can be discovered across the skies of Paldea. Quaquaval is said to come from another region, but can be found here, and is clearly a duck related to the likes of Swanna. Squawkabilly is super interesting. There are 4 different variations of it across the Paldea mainland, and all 4 of these Pokemon that are based off of a parrot and they have a musical nature are the 4 colors that make up Chatot. I suspect the Pokemon here to be very closely related. Kilowattrel is a Cormorine and very closely related to the likes of Cramorant. There is Flamigo, the flamingo, and then Espathra, which has such an interesting evolution, evolving from Flittle and then metamorphosizing into this form, which is very likely related to the likes of Dodrio. There's also, of course, Bombardier, again, another avian. And then we move on one last time before getting on to legendary Pokemon and bigger things, the mammals. Meowscarada is, of course, a cat. Oinkologne itself is a pig, much like a Grumpig. Mousehold is, of course, a mouse or a group of mice. We have Mabostiff and Houndstone, which are 2 new canines. Grafii, which is based off of an ii, which is a type of primate. We have Palafin, which is a dolphin, our first dolphin Pokemon, and dolphins, much like whales, are in fact mammals, not fish. And actually, this can be seen so clearly in the Paldea region with Sea Titan, which is that perfect middle point between something like Hippowdon and something like Whalelord. You can see it lives in the ocean, or should be living in the ocean, but also has legs to walk on land, Highlands and up the snowy mountains of Paldea. We have Farigiraf, which is of course a giraffe, very closely related to the other horses and ungulates of the Pokemon world. And then finally, we have Annihilate. I've been wanting to talk about Primeape since Generation 1. And of course, yes, it is an ape, but I think it's an ape that actually helps place slacking on the evolutionary tree. When you look to their Pokedex entries, you learn that Annihilate ends up as an Annihilate as a result of a Primeape that rages too much. It rages its way into the afterlife. Slacking is like the opposite of this, and you can see how there are design similarities between Primeape and Slacking. I do wonder if Primeape just calmed down, would have eventually evolved into something more like a Slacking. However, we're not done there. Yes, we've traveled around the mainland of every Pokemon region. We've talked about mammals and reptiles, amphibians, nidaria, echinoderms, and everything else. However, there are other species of Pokemon. Much like we had to get fanciful with Draconis and adding a new branch there, we need to talk about ghosts and living plants, and of course, legendary Pokemon. But first, let us look to the stars. Since the days of Generation 1, we've known that some Pokemon probably came from space. How Pokemon DNA got into space? Well, that is answered in the opening clip of the animated series, where we see Mew heading off into space. It's a well-documented phenomenon. The DNA of Pokemon is out there. For a long time, you might have thought of Starmie as an echinoderm, but no, this is this new branch of the evolutionary tree. These are the space Pokemon. It has signals that it beams up into space. To whom or to what, we don't quite know. Also, in Generation 1, we saw both Clefable and Wigglytuff. Both evolutionary lines are very closely related, with pink tufts on their head. They've got the same kind of body shape. Both of these Pokemon have the same kind of evolutionary line. The baby Pokemon introduced in Generation 2, they evolve via a moonstone, given their connection to space. The shiny form of these Pokemon are exactly the same. So yeah, these Pokemon from space are absolutely related. In fact, it may be the case that Jigglypuff is able to inflate so much as a result of different environments to those found on Earth. Ordino is also probably related to these Pokemon, and I would suggest so too is Togekiss and the entire Togepi line. Togekiss can be seen in the animated series coming from a weird mirage paradise. It's not of this world. Additionally, when it comes to a number of these Pokemon, they've actually been confirmed by scientists in the world of Pokemon to be aliens. Speaking of alien Pokemon life forms, this is a wonderful explanation for the Pokemon Sableye, who is in itself based off of an alien, the Hopsville Goblin, and has a particular interest in eating Carbink. I haven't mentioned many of the rock-bodied Pokemon yet, like Carbink, but yes, I believe they all came from space. Carbink and Golem. Golem's Alolan form, Sudowoodo, Gigalith, Garganacl, Colossal. All of these Pokemon are living rock. And yes, they take some drastically different forms. When you look to Garganacl or Gigalith, you see, well, Goliaths of rock. But when you look to Sudowoodo, you see a tree. I believe that this is a result of the evolutionary line that is Sudowoodo adapting to look like trees here on Earth. We know for a fact Sudowoodo is not a tree, and it is living rock, but this is a defense mechanism as it learns to look like things on Earth. In terms of rocks, I think that's where Palossand comes from as well. Ultimately, it's just the beaten down grains of rock in the form of sand with its own consciousness in the Pokemon world. Macago is another one of these living rocks. At first, you might think it's a mollusk because it looks kind of like a snail, but again, I believe it's evolved to look like a snail now here on Earth, but it's more like a mini planet. It's got a rock-like crust, much like a planet, that's the shell, and then the interior is magma hot, and that is, again, much like another planet, except in the case of Macago, that heat, that magma is spewing out, creating the body of the Pokemon. They say if it were to burn even hotter at the temperatures that the Pokedex claims it does, it would actually be more of a purple color, and we actually see this in its shiny form. So perhaps shiny Macago, that is the hottest version of this Pokemon. The reason I believe all of these rock-bodied Pokemon came from space, not only because we see Pokemon like Starmie with its rock-like gem core, but also because there literally are confirmed reports of rock-bodied Pokemon coming from space. Minior, Lunatone, Solrock, and Behem are all Pokemon that are clearly made of living rock. They've evolved out there in space, and while Pokemon like Lunatone and Solrock are crashing down on Earth today, and so they look a little bit more alien-esque, Pokemon like Golem and Palossand and Sudowoodo and Colossal have probably been around on Earth for thousands, if not millions of years, giving them time to evolve and change shape and adapt into the various forms that they are today. I believe this is also probably the case for lots of metal Pokemon. Ultimately, metal is just another form of rock. I think this is a great explanation for Steelix and Bronzong, which can open portals to other dimensions, which is a very space Pokemon thing to do. There's Metagross and Magnezone. Both of these Pokemon are even said to come from space in their Pokedex entries, and both of these Pokemon are clearly very closely related, being made up of multiple versions of their lesser evolutions. Then there's Klinklang, which is also like this, but looks a little bit more like something you'd find on Earth, and I think this is also the case for Arcaladon, a brand new Pokemon that looks like a bridge. How do you explain this in evolution? Well, it's just like Sudowoodo. Many millions of years ago, yeah, a Pokemon crashed down to Earth, and over time these Pokemon have adapted to look like their environments, to look like their surroundings because it helps them blend in, it helps them survive. Out in the coldness of space, it might also be an explanation for a number of these ice-bodied Pokemon. Vanillux and Cryogonal are among these, but we also have Avalugg and Hisuian Avalugg, which proves that these ice-bodied Pokemon have been arriving on Earth for the longest of times. But for now, let's head back to Earth and return to the ground, whether we should talk about trees, and not just the evolutionary tree, which you can get as a poster using the link at the top of the description for a very limited time, but we should talk about plant Pokemon. Now, in the real world, in our world, plants are not related to the animal kingdom. They're an entirely different, separate branch of life. Much the same as bacteria is a different form of life, and in fact, even so too, are fungi a different form of life. In fact, funguses are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. However, in the Pokemon world, this is going to have to work a little bit differently, because regular funguses and plants do exist in the world of Pokemon. Trees are everywhere in the Pokemon world. So something like a Vileplume is not like a tree. It's more like a Pokemon than it is a plant. It is a living creature with plant-like features. Let's just talk about some of those plant Pokemon for a moment. We've got Ferrothorn and Tangrowth, Victreebel, Blossom, Vileplume, a Carnivine, which is a predator plant. There's big tree Pokemon like a Abomasnow and Executor in its lowland form. Cactus Pokemon like Cacturne and Maractus. There's Sunflora and Scoville and Arboliver and Cherim. All of these plant Pokemon are obviously related to one another. You can see many of them beginning to take on humanoid forms. This is not too dissimilar by way of convergent evolution. This has already happened up in Mammalia with Pokemon like Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee. But where could all of these plant Pokemon have come from? How do they fit onto the tree of evolution? Well, I believe their living ancestor, the fossil that kind of points to them, is Cradily, a Pokemon that is in itself a sea lily. Now, in the real world, sea lilies are stuck down on the sea floor, but we know based on Pokedex entries that Cradily actually came on land to hunt. With its ability to move in a way that sea lilies can't, I think Cradily is a pivotal fossil, giving rise to a web of evolution here in the lands of the Pokemon world. In previous iterations of the tree, I talked about Executor and Alolan Executor as potentially being a little bit more like Tropius and Meganium, and that the draconic nature of Alolan Executor meant that it was probably somehow related to them, but I've decided to backpedal on that. While it's a really fun idea, I actually think it is just a big tree. Now, I've talked about these humanoid plant creatures. You could sort of see this in the likes of Cacturne, but also definitely in Arboliver. Arboliver is a Pokemon that when you look to its pre-evolution Dolive, you learn that it's lived side by side with humans for a long time. It seems likely to me that these plant-like humanoid Pokemon evolved to look this way, to look humanoid, to avoid one simple thing: being preyed on by humans, who might otherwise use the plants that grow from these Pokemon for food or for medicine. And in fact, by allowing Odolive to evolve into an Arboliver, it then gives away its oil to people for free. So it's a strong evolutionary strategy. So strong, in fact, that we see Lurantis, Lilligant, Hisuian Lilligant. So this is kind of evolutionary track has been happening for a long time. We've got Roserade and Serena and Shiftry. All of these Pokemon mark kind of plant life becoming humanoid. But let's head back down the branches of the tree of evolution for just a moment and talk about fungi. And yeah, they are some pretty fun guys. We've got Shinotic and Toedscruel and Among Us. A Pokemon that's evolved to have a Pokeball on its head. It looks this way, maybe to attract strong Pokemon trainers to use it. But this isn't too dissimilar to another grass Pokemon that can be found in the days of old Hisui, Hisuian Electrode. I used to believe that Electrode was a possessed Pokeball, first discovered in a Pokeball factory. But you have to remember that Pokeball factories back in the day were probably factories of hollowing out apricorns. And based on its Pokedex entries and everything we know about Hisuian Electrode, it seems to be some kind of fungally infected apricorn that's become oversized and inflated. That's what this Pokemon is. It's very likely closely related to Among Us of modern day. There are also a number of spore-like Pokemon. We see this in Whimsicott, Eldegoss, and Jumpluff, and then also a number of Pokemon that are based off of like sugarcane, for example, which is another plant. We see this very strongly in Alchemy and all of its different forms, which is almost definitely related to Slurpuff, and Slurpuff might to you look a little bit like a dog. And again, I think this is an example of convergent evolution, but it's definitely more closely related to the likes of Alchemy. If this is the case, then this also makes sense as a place for Dachsbun to exist. Dachsbun being related to Slurpuff, and again, its body is mostly made up of wheat, right. It just happens to look like a canine because if it looks like a canine, its main predator, humans, are less likely to eat it. Yes, the branch of this tree that deals with plant life and creatures like this might be a little bit more speculative, and there are all sorts of unusual things in the world of plants. We have Bramblegast and Delmise. Delmise isn't actually an anchor, it's the seaweed on the anchor possessing the anchor, and actually we see Trevenant and Gorgeist, pretty similarly possessed plants. There are stories, of course, of Phantom being a child lost in the woods, but I think biologically speaking, no, it's just a kind of cursed tree. Cursed seaweed and plant life brings rise to Poltegeist, made from cursed tea leaves. What's interesting though is that another form of Poltegeist, Sinistcha, has been discovered. However, the scientists of the Pokemon world don't seem to think that Poltegeist and Sinistcha are related, but instead suggest they're more like Wugdrio and its relationship to Dugtrio. However, I'm gonna have to disagree with the scientists of the Pokemon world here, who, to be fair, did originally think that Wugdrio was a regional variation of Dugtrio. I think they've also got this wrong. For Poltegeist comes from cursed tea, which is tea leaves, and Sinistcha is the same, just from matcha. Though, to be fair, there may be as much variety in tea leaves as there are in plant life generally, so maybe they really are convergent evolutions of each other. Maybe they should have gone for a pumpkin spice latte instead. And speaking of pumpkin, of course, I mentioned Gorgeist. It's this big orb-like Pokemon that is ultimately plant life, but it also has heat at its core. I think this is a wonderful Pokemon to segue into a group of life which we see in Chandelure and Drifblim, Weezing and Galarian Weezing. We know Galarian Weezing existed before modern technology. After all, we see it on the galactic headquarter building, so this Pokemon is natural. And these are gaseous orb Pokemon, but I think their body mostly is made up of like plant matter. Plant matter that's so light that it's able to levitate with just a little bit of heat. That's why Drifblim is a hot air balloon. Weezing, of course, is filled with gas, and Chandelure is, well, a lantern with many tentacles. It's just not too dissimilar to Pumpkaboo. And the humanoid plants, you can see that this tree of evolution is ultimately very, very peculiar. It is from here that I believe that sprite Pokemon, like Florges and Glamora, Klefki and Chimecho, which are very, very similar, and Comfey, all have come from. I suspect this is also where we see Goldengo and Grimmsnarl, which has sort of plant-like matter on its body, but at this point the evolutionary tree has gone so far out that its biology is very, very different. This is also the zone where Marwar would fit in as one of these sort of yokai spirits. We have Mismagius, and I think Mismagius is most likely related to a Pokemon called Hatterene, which again is one of these humanoid Pokemon like Tinkaton and Gothitelle and Jinx. I think all these Pokemon are not too distantly related from the likes of Roserade and Serena and Shiftry. Just down the branch a little bit, I think this is also where we see Pokemon like Mr. Rhyme and Mr. Mime. And while it probably is the most speculative part of the tree, between them all, I think this is where we see the origins of Pokemon like Gardevoir, Gallade, Armarouge, Ceruledge, Kingambit, Frostlass, and Glalie, as well as the Pokemon Phalanx. Phalanx is not too dissimilar to the pre-evolution to Glalie and Frostlass, which is Snorunt. You could sort of see how those Pokemon would be related. Frostlass not too dissimilar from Gardevoir. Gardevoir, of course, related to Gallade, and Gallade not too dissimilar to Kingambit and Armarouge and Ceruledge. So I think all of these Pokemon exist on this branch of life. It's quite a peculiar branch, but it does make sense for the Pokemon world. All of these Pokemon coming from one common ancestor millennia ago, Cradily. Now there are other Pokemon, unnatural Pokemon, that don't really share DNA with any other living ancestor, or if they do, it doesn't make sense to put them on a tree of evolution because ultimately they are not the result of evolution, they are the result of human engineering. This will also be the first mention of legendary Pokemon across the tree of evolution, because there are a number of legends of the Pokemon world that ultimately were made by people. Silvally is a Pokemon that was made as a result of trying to create something that could conquer the Ultra Beasts. We'll talk about them a little bit later on. It does so by trying to mimic the powers of a god, Arceus. There's also Genesect, a sort of revived fossil that's been mutated. From millions of years ago, it was a hunter, most likely an arthropod like Kabutops or perhaps Scyther. That is what Genesect is all about, being used by Team Plasma. Magearna is ultimately a human-made Pokemon. That much is evidently clear in its shape and its design. And there's Volcanion, a Pokemon that I believe was created by Team Flare. It has a supernatural organ inside it, allowing fire and water to coexist. Then, of course, there's the obvious one, Mewtwo, made from the DNA of Mew, the ancestor of all Pokemon life. But not all human-made Pokemon are legendary. There's also Ditto. Ditto is an odd one, potentially a failed cloning attempt of Mew. Both Mew and Ditto share similar traits, both of which have shiny Pokemon, and Mew can be found in the Pokemon Mansion and in Cerulean Cave, where Mewtwo once lived. Science has also created Castform and Porygon Z. A regular Porygon was designed to investigate cyberspace. When upgraded into Porygon 2, it was meant for deep space, and then ultimately ultimately Porygon Z was meant to explore alternate dimensions, but ultimately the data was corrupted. There are 4 fossil Pokemon in the Galar region that represent 4 Pokemon that did exist in the ancient past. However, their DNA has been completely jumbled up. I couldn't possibly put them on the Tree of Evolution because, well, they're multiple creatures, each of them. Perhaps one day we'll finally see what they were, but for now, these things are the result of only human experimentation. There are golems as well in the Pokemon world. Not Golem, though there is Golem in the Pokemon world, but there is Stonjourner and Golurk, Probopass and Claydol. All of these Pokemon are sentries brought to life often by cosmic rays or special energies that ultimately guard the relics and ruins of the Pokemon world. Probopass in particular, I think, was created by the Draconids to always be able to point them north to the Sinnoh region. The results of human meddling, though, in the Pokemon world also likely created Grimer, a sort of toxified sludge. It may have come from rubbish coming alive, this like Garbodor, or it may be some kind of mutated under the X-rays of the moon. Not really sure, its Pokedex entry is a little all over the place. Result of Ditto transforming into human waste. However, it is now a creature of the Pokemon world and even has its own Alolan form. Then finally, there are a number of objects that have sort of become possessed. These creatures couldn't exist without human interference. And possessed by what? Possibly just the energies of the Pokemon world. There's Brevaru, which is a sort of engine come alive. Aegislash, which represents the swords of fallen enemies on the battlefield. Covagrigus and Brunigus, which represent items of great spiritual energy. So too is their Banette, a cursed or possessed doll. And then there's Mimikyu. It's interesting to note that Mimikyu is technically the energy or the creature under the blanket, but we've never seen a Mimikyu without this blanket, nor have we ever seen a Mimikyu with any other blanket. I do wonder if the possessed doll of a Pikachu ultimately becomes this Pokemon, much like Banette. And of course, there is Spiritomb, and this is a really fun one. Spiritomb is the result of 108 angry spirits being infused in the Odd Keystone, and the Odd Keystone ultimately is an item that is human-made. It's kind of similar to how Runegus would work. But there is something to note that has come up in Pokemon research. It's been noted to me by Professor Lavington back in the day. I was going through his research notes, and well, we learned that Hisuian Typhlosion, which has similar spiritual flames to that of Spiritomb, creates with its attack 108 spirits. These wisps disappear, and if these wisps were to become separated from Typhlosion, perhaps they'd be like the wisps that we find all over the Hisui region. Perhaps this is where the spiritual energy for Pokemon like Spiritomb, Aegislash, and Runegus, and Cofagrigus, and Banette, and Mimikyu comes from. Perhaps it comes from the ghostly attacks of other Pokemon that somehow manifest and attach to objects, become life forms of their own. It used to be that ghosts were their own whole section of the evolutionary tree, but actually in doing this series, we've accounted for nearly every ghost type Pokemon. The only one I haven't mentioned is the OG ghost, Gengar. Yeah, there are Pokedex entries talking about how Gengar is a dead human, but I'm just no longer convinced by that. Ghost Pokemon aren't literally zombies or ghouls. The ghost energy is just one part of infinity energy, the energy that makes up all Pokemon, and any Pokemon can use ghost attacks or be part ghost type. So when I think of Gengar and I try and think about it biologically, we look to a Pokemon that I think is probably related to it as well, which is Clefable. Much like the connections between Clefable and Wigglytuff, there are connections between Clefable and Gengar. Gengar is said to be Clefable's shadow. And given its spooky and odd nature, it would make sense if Gengar ultimately came from space, from some kind of dark mirror planet to the one that Clefable is from. Maybe if Clefable is from the moon and evolves from the Moonstone, Gengar is from the dark side of the moon. Or perhaps the moon in another dimension. It does have Pokedex entries talking about how it's trying to claw its way through to this very dimension, and that can be seen in its evolutionary line, with Ghastly being a head, Haunter being the hands pulled through, and Gengar being the whole body. Mega Gengar may well be the representation of this Pokemon rooting itself into this reality. Speaking of interdimensional Pokemon, we should finally talk about the Ultra Beasts. Ultra Beasts are creatures that are not part of this evolutionary tree. They literally can't be, because they are aliens, not just from other planets, but literally from other universes. It seems unlikely that Mew visited these universes. It seems unlikely that these Pokemon are even really related that much to each other. I suspect that these Pokemon have entirely different biology. Stakataka, Blacephalon, Naganadel, Buzzwole, Pheromosa, Xurkitree, Celesteela, Kartana. These Pokemon are Ultra Beasts, of course. Nihiligo may look like a squid, but its body is made of rock. We just can't make sense of them. There's also Solgaleo, Lunala, and Necrozma. These three Pokemon are more Pokemon-like than the other Ultra Beasts, but are still Ultra Beasts. They've had time to adapt to this reality. Eternatus may be a similar kind of life form. We really can't be too sure. Its origins may also be godly, otherworldly and legendary. We'll talk about more legendary Pokemon in a moment. There's also Guzzlord, the world destroyer that is said to be a parallel version of the legendary Zygarde. You can see how their bodies are similar. They've got the big body mouth parts, the multiple appendages, the smaller crowned head on the top. Both are dragon type and both can be found in environments that look pretty similar here in the real world, but ultimately they are alternate dimension versions of each other, so they're not related to one another. In fact, if there is any Pokemon that might be related to Guzzlord, and this is the only place on the evolutionary tree I think this Pokemon could go, it would be Dusknoir, a Pokemon whose body is just that of a mini Guzzlord's. You can see that in its design. It has Pokédex entries talking about how inside of its stomach is, well, another dimension or a black hole. This is exactly the same as Guzzlord and the bottomless pit that is its stomach. Okay, but then what about other legendary Pokemon? Well, I think it's finally time for us to get there before we talk about humans. So, you already know that I believe that the Pokemon world, the Tree of Evolution, stemmed out from the Pokemon Mew. Now, Mew is the Pokemon that contains the DNA of all Pokemon. There's actually one other Pokemon that I think came from Mew, and that Pokemon is Rienculus. It's another embryotic psychic type Pokemon and represents single-celled organisms. I think this is in fact the origin Pokemon for all other Pokemon species, and I suspect there's a number of these different Rienculuses, each of which contains the potential for all the variety of Pokemon species that we see across the Pokemon world, and each of these came from Mew. But then the question becomes, where did Mew come from? There doesn't actually need to be an answer to this. We know from the Pokemon world that things can just grow naturally. We see trees and humans. We see animals in the Pokemon world. Animals are, of course, now extinct in the Pokemon world, so maybe Pokemon were the same. But no, Pokemon literally are the stuff of magic. They were once known as magical creatures, and I think Mew came from 3 specific Pokemon: Azelf, Uxie, and Mesprit. You can see the similarities right away. But then the question becomes, where did these Pokemon come from? And well, these Pokemon came from Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. And where did these Pokemon come from? Well, they are separated parts of Arceus, the mythical Pokemon that is said to have started everything. Where did Arceus come from? Well, we don't really know. This is just Arceus's Pokemon form. There are said to be other Pokemon out there that are part of the Arceus, perhaps Necrozma and Eternatus and Zygarde, but we can't be sure. Anyway, it's possible that Arceus is the explanation for the entire Pokemon tree. We just don't have an explanation for it. Maybe the explanation for it is the unknown that are said to come from another dimension, but then we need to ask, where did that dimension come from? And the questions keep on going. For now, let's focus on the Pokemon world. There is a Pokemon called Wobbuffet that clearly isn't biologically related to anything, but if you look at Wobbuffet's Pokédex entry, you learn that the actual Pokemon is not the body of this Pokemon, it's just the tail, which when you look to its pre-evolution Wyna is clearly an unknown. It seems that Unknown have taken this form, and that's why Wobbuffet and Unknown are next to each other in the Pokédex. They're both psychic type Pokemon too. And there are a number of other Pokemon that I think that Arceus created to help keep order in the Pokemon world. Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem, Xerneas, Yveltal. There's also a huge family of Regis, these legendary golems that helped shape the Poke-Earth. Regirock, Ice, Steel, Drago, and Lecky, all of which are under the dominion of Regigigas. Similar to them, guarding over the Alolan Islands, possibly put in place to repel Ultra Beast invasions from this universe, are the Tapus, Koko, Lele, Finny, and Bulu. Marshadow is a Pokemon whose origins are completely unknown. If it is biologically related to anything, it could be Gengar, but that would be hugely speculative. From the world of dreams, a different reality, are the Therian forms of the forces of natures: Landorus, Tornadus, Thundurus, and Enamorus. But all of these Pokemon, much like Giratina, have the form that they stay in when they're in this reality, the form that makes them more comfortable here, and the form that they're in their origin reality, suggesting that the dream world really is a real place in the universe of Pokemon. If so, it's occupied by 2 other entities, Darkrai and Cresselia, possibly created by Arceus to govern that world. Heatran, like Marshadow, might be the result of biology, but we're really not sure. If it is, I'd suspect the Pokemon it be related to is Bastiodon. They are actually quite similar, but then again, maybe not. And there's one Pokemon that's sort of a debated Pokemon legendary. Officially, by all scientific accounts, Rotom is not a legendary Pokemon. However, when you first encounter it in the old Chateau, it uses legendary Pokemon music. And biologically speaking, there just isn't a good explanation for its origin. However, the origins of every legendary Pokemon aren't so mysterious. Latias and Latios, for example, may well be related to the likes of Togekiss. They share similar body patterns, and Latias and Latios Arceus have similar Pokédex entries talking about how they only like to appear in times of happiness and to kind-hearted people. They're also seen living in mirage spaces, in gardens, much like Togekiss. I also suspect the mythical Hooper has come from somewhere in deep space. Its key attack is Hyperspace Fury, and it travels by way of portals, not something you need if you're a terrestrial to the planet. We know Jirachi and Deoxys are from space, mutated space viruses or comets, and Diancie is the result of a mutation in carbing. Similarly, Melmetal is just like the other metal-bodied Pokemon from space. Phione and Manaphy are sea angels. They're mollusks, and not too dissimilar to the likes of Gastrogon or Goodra. Celebi, well, we can't be sure on its origins, but its biology is just not too dissimilar to Illumise or Volbeat. There are the Swords of Justice, Terrakion, Virizion, Cobalion, Keldeo, as well as Glastrier and Spectrier, and all of these horse Pokemon are very closely related to the likes of Rapidash. Of course, there is Zeraora, a big cat, a feline, most likely related to the likes of Electivire and Luxray. And then there are Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. If they're biologically related to anything, it's the Evolutions. The Evolutions are a common mainstay of Ecruteak City. And the day that the tower burnt down, it was possible it was these three Pokemon trapped. You can see Raikou, Entei, and Suicune's design. They are feline in nature, but there are some canine-like traits. This amalgamation of mammalian traits is what defines the Evolutions. More solidly canine, though, are Zacian and Zamazenta. Good doggos. There's Victini, which is an amalgamation of smaller mammalian traits, something kind of rabbit-like, but also a little spirit-like. Urshifu, of course, is a bear, and Calyrex is like Victini in that it's a number of different traits. If anything, I'd put it closely related to rabbits. Zarude is, of course, a mythical ape, and then there's a number of legendary birds. Moltres, Zapdos, Articuno. They're regional variations from the Galar region, Ho-Oh, and Lugia. Lugia is probably a little less bird-like. In fact, it's probably more closely related to the likes of Lapras and the Plesiosaurs, but the other ones definitely, of course, are avian. In fact, you can see how Galarian Zapdos is almost definitely closely related to the likes of Dodrio and Espathra. It is possible the soul of the Firebird on the end of Skeledirge's nose actually could separate from Skeledirge, and if so, that could be the origin point for Pokemon like Moltres. We just can't know with these legendary Pokemon. Meloetta, of course, is one of those kind of humanoid, feminine, spirit fairy creatures, so it's around the area with Jinx. Then there are four particularly interesting legendary Pokemon found in the Paldea region. Chenpao appears to be a snow leopard, so that would be a mammal. Wuchen, a mollusk. Ting Lu, an ungulate, so again, another mammal. And Chi-Yu, a fish made of fire? I suspect they're actually truly none of the above. These Pokemon are possessed items with great mythical power in them that seem to have come alive and taken these forms. Ogapon is very spirit-like and probably closely related to the likes of Marwal and Grimmsnarl. And then across Kithkami, there are three other legendary Pokemon. I think they're legends anyway. Ogi-Dogi is, of course, some kind of giant dog-like creature. If biologically related to anything, Monkey-Dory is not actually related to a monkey. It's actually related to an ape, because again, it doesn't appear to be a tail. And then there's Pheasantipity, which of course is a pheasant, like Unpheasant. Ha! And I nearly forgot Shaman, so here it is. The last mythical, the last Shaman. I'm gonna stick with its regular form and place it as a hedgehog that can change its biology quite drastically. And then finally, there is Terrapagos. Terrapagos is absolutely colossal. It is said to grow in size and theorized that maybe the Paldea region itself even came off of the back of a Terrapagos long ago. You may have heard myths and rumors of other legendary Pokemon out there in the world. Legendary Pokemon truly are the fruits of the gods. But there'll always be rumors of new Pokemon, whether it's one new mythical or a whole new generation. I'm sure they fit on the tree of evolutionary life somewhere. Then of course there is Pecharunt, a peach that is a ghost type, a deceased peach. Perhaps it's some adaptation of the Pecha Berry. The mythical Pecha Berry is used to access the Pecharunt event. Or maybe it's a fruit that spawned from the tree at the heart of Area Zero's Underdepths. Certainly the power of Pecharunt and granting wishes through the toxic chain has its connections to Paldean lore. Whoa, what's going on? What happens when people play God, or when they channel their dreams to enter alternate realities? What exactly are the paradox Pokemon? Are they created by the wishes and wills of people? The results of a time machine, or a time machine perhaps that accesses other universes? Biologically, what is a Great Tusk or an Iron Treads? Is it most like its the closest living counterpart, which is Donphan, with magic altering their forms? On a tree of evolution, maybe the correct thing to do wouldn't actually be to branch them out from Donphan, but that is what I'm going to do. Theoretically here, from the ancient past, we have Screamtail, which is closely related to, of course, Wigglytuff. Brute Bunnet, closely related to Among Us. Fluttermane, related to Miss Magius Slitherwing, which is related to Volcarona, Sandy Shocks, which is closely related to Magnezone, and then Roaring Moon, a Pokemon so cool and most closely related to Salamence. There are also the legendary Walking Wake, Raging Bolt, and Gouging Fire. And these three Pokemon were once thought to perhaps be the beasts that fell in the Towers of Ecruteak, but thanks to new evidence, I'm not so sure. I think we do know where these came from. From the Violet book, we have Iron Crown, Iron Leaves, and Iron Boulder, similarly. And again, it's much the same thing. Are these truly cyborgs from the future, or were they created by the imagination of a mad scientist? The other future Pokemon, of course, we have are Iron Bundle, which is most closely related to Delibirds, Iron Hands, which is related to Hariyama, Iron Jugulus, which is related to Hydreigon, Iron Moth, which is again Volcarona, Iron Thorns, which is Tyranitar, and then finally the Iron Valiant, most closely related to both Gallade and Gardevoir. So, where have they all come from? Well, news has come down from the top researcher on this subject, Professor Sada, or was it Churro? But they believe these Pokemon to truly be from the pasts and futures of alternate timelines. So biologically, they probably do match their variations on the tree of evolution wherever they belong. However, their common ancestry with their present counterpart Pokemon may not have even happened yet, may have happened a long time in the past, or may not have happened at all due to them coming from such a different universe, somewhere between the Pokemon we know and the Ultra Beasts of other dimensions. But unlike Ultra Beasts, if you put them under the microscope, biologically, they look much like our own Pokemon. Humans have had such a great impact on the Pokemon world, and as we scope out from the Pokemon evolutionary tree, we realize that the entire tree itself is just another branch of life on a much larger tree. And there's also even special forms of bacteria that we're discovering, like Pokerus, which enhances the power of Pokemon. There are animals, or there were once upon a time. Most of these animals and their various depictions across the animated series and the card games and mentions in the video game series have ultimately gone extinct, likely destroyed by a more powerful predator. But there is one animal in the entire Pokemon animal kingdom that has not gone extinct, and that is humans. For whatever reason, there is a symbiotic relationship that works between Pokemon and people. Pokemon don't typically become very strong in the wild on their own. They're not typically able to metamorphose into their ultimate forms, their main evolutions, or even mega evolution, which can only be achieved in the presence of a human. And while there are many humans that have been bad actors, using the Berserk gene of Mewtwo, for example, to create an army of shadow Pokemon and trying to alter the Pokemon's powers that way, ultimately it is humans who work alongside their Pokemon that empower them. There have been legends of a special Greninja transformation that happened as the result purely of a bond between trainer and their Greninja. So that explains what the Pokemon get out of the relationship with people, but what do people get? Well, they are able to use these Pokemon in battle, to work side by side with them, to advance their technologies and advance their communities. In fact, in the face of the threat of Ultra Beast from space, Guzzlord eating entire worlds, or Necrozma stealing the light of planets, being friends with Pokemon, being able to help defend your planet against the threats of the universe is a useful thing for every trainer to be able to do. It is only by having trainers across the Pokemon world like you and me that the Pokemon world is safe. It's a Pokemon world where, of course, other forms of life grow. I already mentioned plants, trees, foliage, and of course fungi all already exist. There's also a special kind of fungi that specifically operates on parasect, but that fungi might also be a Pokemon. It's really hard to know. There are so many mysteries in the Pokemon world, and I have loved thoroughly uncovering them and finding out everything I can about this Pokemon tree of evolution, using both science and a little bit Pokemon theory. And we're about to discover a ton more Pokemon, which I'll put on the Generation 10 poster, which will be available on storekeepertoby.com. And subscribe as we discover more Pokemon together.